All right, we're live.
All
Jay,
right. Hey,
good morning. How you going?
how are you? Yeah, very well.
Oh man, I'm excited. Ever since you sent me this folder of photos through, I've been excited. I've been looking at
Yeah.
them, yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a bit
Um,
of a span of a long and illustrious career to date. So
After like we chatted on the phone the other day, and after that, even like I dug through a little bit of stuff, and I knew you'd done a lot. And then you sent these through, and I was like, okay, he's done more, even more than I thought. And I'd already thought you'd done a lot. So it's
yeah, look, it's easy to forget what you've done. I mean, when it becomes work, you're just doing it. Do you
yeah,
remember a day at work on the best of days? Not really. So it's not until you
exactly.
look back and dive into a tower of 4 terabyte hard drives sitting in a room to dig this stuff up that you go, oh yeah, I did that.
It brings back some good memories. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately that um, I don't have a good way to look back through my work easily, or even also integrate some of my day to day into that as sort of a memory. I'd love to have kind of not a social media account that is a memory of my life. Photos that I really love. I don't know where to keep all of that. Lightroom
No.
catalogs get so full and just full of work and stuff like that. So I'm actually trying to figure it out at the moment.
Well, it's funny you say that because the thing that's triggering me to memories of stuff that I've shot is Facebook. You get the memories that come up every now and then, and
Yeah.
some stuff that even came up this morning from 10 years ago, and on this day 10 years ago and 5 years ago, it's just like, man, there's all this cool shit that's been going on that you just forget you've done.
Interesting. Okay, so social media's got some good points too. It's it gets demonized a lot, but it does
Oh
seem
yeah.
it reminds us of things. I got that as well. I got something pop up today that I was like, oh yeah, 10 years ago. And
Mm.
then it makes you feel old though.
Well, it does,
Um,
but then you dive in and find your hard drive and dig through some stuff. And not only that, I find over the years your taste change in images. I go back and look through, for
yeah,
example, some hard drives from my earliest trips through to Africa, where a bulk of it was shot on film, and I don't really drag out the negs and the prints from that shoot. But the first trip back in 2004 was, I was working for Nikon at the time, and that was
yeah,
shooting on a D2H. So looking at a 4 megapixel digital camera, and you pull open the files and there's not a whole lot you can do with them. But even some of the earlier trips, 2007, using 1D Mark IINs at 8 megapixel, and all these photographers crying over, oh, there's not enough resolution, I'm so disappointed with that new release, the Nikon Z8's just been announced, and, oh, I thought it was going to
yeah.
be 61. It's like, it doesn't look any different on your mobile phone. So
uh,
you know, and
Man,
I've just found with a change in taste, you dive through old archives of images and you start re-editing stuff, and you're thinking, why did I never pick up this image before? Like,
yeah,
you
yep.
know,
You discover a diamond that was in there hiding amongst because, but I know what it's like. You come back from a trip and you've got thousands of photos to look through, and maybe you've got something you need to deliver, whether it's for a client or for a gallery or something
yeah.
like that. So you sort of got some time pressure to get through the images, and you kind of end up just skimming over something that maybe you didn't catch your eye at the time, but then later on you look back and you're like, that was a banger image. It's just hiding
Mm.
on a hard drive.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's easier to do. I mean, between shooting travel and wildlife predominantly professionally, but before that, shooting for newspapers, sport, and a lot of stuff in the music industry is where I actually started as a photographer. Up until probably, I'd say, 10 years ago, I just gave up on shooting music for the sheer fact that there's no money left in it. But,
Yeah.
a couple of things obviously will bounce in and out of different stuff through the career as we go. But it really is the sort of thing that I find just plugging in an old archive drive and just dive in and have a look around. And you'd be surprised the amount of stuff that pops up that you've never considered as a great image. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So, okay. So you mentioned music. You mentioned first trip to Africa. What did you say was 2004
Yeah.
or 2000? Yeah. So how did the first trip to Africa come about?
So
Like,
for years, even since I was a young kid, I've been obsessed with wildlife documentaries, but particularly African wildlife documentaries, and even a lot of childhood memories. Something was on telly with, back then it would have been, David Attenborough, still my hero. The one guy if I could swap a life with would be that guy. But even as a young kid, remembering if there was something on telly, mum or dad would be, oh, some wildlife shows are on telly, and I'd be sitting glued to them, you know. And funny enough, as a kid, I was terrified of sharks. I couldn't even watch them on TV. And, you know, I'd literally be sitting there with a blanket over my head if a shark came on telly, and now I'm fascinated by the things. I don't know if that phobia is completely disappeared. I couldn't say I'd be comfortable in the water with one, but, you know, there'd been opportunities to do a photographic trip that I was running with Canon a few years back, which was with Rodney Fox on his boat shooting great white sharks and whatnot. And due to some circumstances in the family, I couldn't go last minute and sent some other colleagues instead. But, you know, I still can't say if the phobia is broken because I didn't get the opportunity. But look, going back to the question, 2004, you know, growing up being obsessed with wildlife docos, I got to the point where I'd finished high school in, you know, 97 and started working. So at that time, out of school, was working for Kodak and, you know, developed in their print labs and whatnot back there.
How did you get that job?
Just out of school, funnily enough, during school and studying. So after I'd left high school, you know, I had a job at Cash Converters for a while, selling cameras and guitars. And obviously, when the good stuff came in, I'd say, I'll meet you up 5 o'clock in the alley around the corner and I'll give you $100 for it. But that's where a lot of my early camera gear came from. But there was a point where, funnily enough, I was fired at Cash Converters for whatever reason. I can't even recall what it was. It was, you know, I just wasn't interested anymore.
Yeah.
And I left and went, oh, okay, well, you know, I've lost my job at the ripe age of, I was probably 18 or 19. Yeah. And I thought, well, before I go home, I'm just going to go to the food court, get some lunch, and wandered past one of the Kodak Express stores. And I just wandered in to see if there was any jobs going. And she said, oh, you know, not much. And, you know, come in and we'll give you maybe 1 day a week or so and see how you go. And within 2 weeks, I got a job full time there. Actually became Kodak Australia's retail arm. They just had these Kodak Express stores. They were called Click camera stores. Yep. And, you know, was the first employee to go down as a full-time sales, camera salesperson and whatnot there. And that's where it started for me at Kodak. So I jumped from there into their head office for a little while, based up in Sydney, and ended up working in inventory management, which was as boring as all hell, just spreadsheets and ordering picture frames and photo albums. But that was my entry into working at Kodak. But, you know, at that time, saved up the money. All my friends were buying cars. I didn't get my license till I was 35. I didn't need a car. You know, right through my career. I mean, working in Sydney, you know, up until I moved to Melbourne about nearly 9 years ago, I didn't need a car. You know, I worked out of Sun Studios up in Sydney and Alexandria, and, you know, I was renting a place in Marrickville, so I just rode my bike every day. But, you know, all my friends back then, early out of school, were throwing all their money at cars and all that type of stuff. I was in a band, you know, touring around. So I spent a lot of my money on amps and guitars and touring around the country and, you know, playing death metal. But
man, I don't want to derail the podcast, but we'll talk about that a bit later. I did the same thing.
Yeah.
But not death metal, but pretty heavy and lots of guitars, lots of amps, lots of money.
Definitely. So, you know, what I was leading to is that the money I was saving was to go overseas. So I ended up in Africa in 2004 to Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. So my first couple of days, it was in Uganda, so up trekking the mountain gorillas. And funnily enough, we actually got attacked by a whole wasp nest. So we were following the silverback for a little bit. And there was all this vine that had overgrown, and we're up to our knees, sort of tangled in this stuff, you know, shooting film most of the time. And it's the sort of thing where, for anyone that's ever done the gorilla trekking, you get an hour with them once you've found them, right? So we found them. They were on the move quite a bit that day, so they weren't really stopping. So we're constantly picking up cameras. You know, I was lugging a 300 2.8 and a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah. And so how much gear, like a full pack worth of gear, like or just a couple of bodies hanging off the shoulders, or
I just had, you know, a small low pro backpack and just a shoulder bag that would fit maybe an SLR and 2 small lenses. Yep. And with that, the trekkers and whatnot, you can pay porters and they'll carry all your bags. I mean, we were walking for the better part of probably 3 or 4 hours uphill to find them. But yeah, as we're following them through the jungle, all of a sudden the silverback started bashing on the sides of these vines that we were walking through, and a big nest of wasps broke open. So we had probably 15 minutes, didn't matter which direction you went, you were covered in the things, and hundreds of stings everywhere. And a 4-hour walk back, and it felt like it'd been set on fire, and vinegar rubbed into every wound. It was itching, stinging, aching all at once. So we just went back to the lodge afterwards after 4 hours and just went straight to the bar. So
yeah, I bet.
And then
wow.
we went and saw a village just outside of the park the next morning. I literally went and saw a witch doctor. He gave me a big ball of green goop. I can't tell you what was in it. He couldn't tell me what was in it. I didn't speak the language. But one of the translators basically said, just rub it on the bites and you'll be fine. And they were right as rain. There were others that were on the trip at the same time that were a bit nervous about, I don't know, I might get an allergic reaction to it or whatever. And theirs come up into big pussy welts for a couple of days and itching. And mine were right.
Worked.
So the
right.
medicine man had the goods.
Knows his stuff. Very cool. Quickly before we continue with the story, I just thought anyone that's watching live, feel free to jump in the chat. There's already some chats coming through. Elena says cool picture, obviously in the background. So yeah, that looks very nice.
That's my favorite one. That's the one for me to beat. Honestly, I'll keep trying, but I don't think I will.
Yeah, it's it's beautiful. I've seen it closer up on the screen that you've sent through to me. We can come back to this story. I'll pull it up now, just since we're talking about it.
For sure.
And yeah, it's just to get that with that overcast lighting, it's not all blown out, and it's how did you come across this?
So this one was taken in Botswana in a place called Mashatu. So Mashatu was in the area called Tuli. So literally the river that separates Botswana and South Africa. So from Johannesburg's probably about a 5-hour drive north. So once you get up over into Mashatu, it's a private reserve and concession. So you can't just turn up there. You have to be staying at their lodge. Mm-hmm. And it's a location that I take a lot of clients to each year. So last year, I'm back here again in November this year. Now, friends of mine, Andre and Shem, own a company in South Africa called C4 Photo Safaris. And they've got a side product that they have built here in Mashatu called Photo Mashatu. And it's a series of underground hides that they've installed. And they've got some custom-made vehicles with support gimbals built in specifically for photographers. So this place here, we've actually buried a 20-foot shipping container in the ground. So I'm as close to those elephants as I would be probably to my laptop screen right now. So
wow.
It's the only way you could get it. And this is a location that probably gets about 5 mils of rain a year. So every other photo we'd seen, this had only been installed and open to the public for probably 8 or 9 months at the time. And every other photo we've seen has been a blue sky and high contrast.
Yes.
So deep shadows, blown highlights, a lot of editing, and you'd get that almost HDR look to things.
Yeah.
And, we got in there, it was a cold morning, which, with wildlife, nothing likes to drink in the cold. So even birds weren't turning up. We're like, oh, okay, this is going to be a long wait. And particularly if it's windy, no plains game. So your gazelles and things, giraffe, this is quite open to walk to the water for wildlife. There's not a lot of cover. So for predators, they can hide and ambush there. So you find on windy days, nothing will really turn up because there's an advantage to a predator to be upwind.
Yeah.
So, prey can't smell them. And then they also use the fact that they can't hear as well when it's windy. So, we're in there for the better part of 2 hours waiting for something to turn up. And we were just getting, guinea fowl and finches and stuff that wasn't overly interesting. Then we come to the point where I'm almost falling asleep. There's, a little bench inside, and I'm starting to nod off. And then you just saw elephants turn up just out of nowhere. Silent. You couldn't even hear the things coming. And then, it was just probably 20 minutes nonstop. Better part of 60 elephants in that herd. And they hung around. They got in, splashed water around. It was just. I just remember putting the cameras down, and my hands were shaking like this just from adrenaline. Yeah. And everything's amplified because you're standing in a 20-foot shipping container up to your chest underground. So every sound, even you could hear them breathing through their trunks, and that was echoing in through the container. So it was everything amplified, just incredible.
Wow. How many were you just taking photos like crazy, just trying to get the shot, like just almost panic mode, just yeah, how long do it might not last for very long, got to keep shooting kind of thing.
Yeah, well, you just don't know. I mean, that was the first experience I'd had in the hide. So, I've been back in here year on year since, and I think this one was 2013.
Okay.
And you've got a lot more control when you know what to expect. But even, going in there after you've done, hours of time in this hide, it's still like the first time from an experience point of view. But from a photographic point of view, you start trying to produce some different pictures. And even at this point, I mean, at that stage, I was using 3 cameras. So I had a 16 to 35 on a 5D Mark III, which is this image at 16. Yeah, so I shot at 16 mil. Then a second body had a 500 f4, and the third body, I believe, would have been either a 100 to 400 or a 70 to 200 2.8.
Yep.
And just picking off shots and just going long, medium, wide. And it's one of my mantras when I shoot for myself, but also when I teach my clients, taking them away on photographic tours, is just shoot everything long, medium, wide. If you're picking up a lens and you start repeating the same pictures, change your lens and keep shooting until you run out of ideas, change your lens again, and you'll start to see different opportunities. There's a fellow called Mike Dexter, a South African photographer, that took a phenomenal shot from this location. And it's a close-up of one of the trunks as it's come up out of the water with a water droplet. But through the water droplet, you can see the rest of the herd.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I haven't seen anyone else nab that shot again since, but it's the type of thing that when you look at these images, I haven't seen another one similar since, just due to conditions. It's very rare that you get overcast skies. So the other thing too is this was originally one 20-foot ship container. So the watering hole was a little bit smaller. Now it's 2 20-foot shipping containers butted together. So they pulled it out of the ground probably 5 or 6 years ago and extended it. So the watering hole's bigger. So to fit that whole watering hole in one shot at 60, you can't do it anymore. So you basically can't get that shot anymore at all. So it's pretty special to me for that reason. But it actually got entered into BBC World Wildlife Photo of the Year that same year, because no one had really seen the shots yet. There are a dime a dozen now from that location. I think I wouldn't enter an image from this location because the judges have probably seen a lot of entries from the Mashatu hide. But in the same year I entered that, I got through to the final judging round in the mammals category. And there was another South African photographer, Greg Dutoy, who entered an image from the hide, completely different looking image. It was shot at night with a slow sync flash and a really blue-white balance. And completely different looking image. We're almost in each other's footprints. But he won the category, and then that year won BBC World Wildlife Photographer of the Year from that location.
From the same spot.
Pretty much, yeah. But an entirely different looking shot.
Yeah.
Oh, and it just goes to show, people's tastes are different. Judges are going to look at images differently. And it was just something they hadn't seen before, as much as this has probably not been seen before at that time. Remote cameras and setting cameras up like that, you probably get something similar, but you've just got no control of the camera once it's remote. It's different now using apps. You can control everything. You can get robotic pan heads and everything else of the sort. So it's not too hard to get it. But Greg's shot was an absolute perler as well.
What a coincidence, the same year. I guess when there's something new like that, it attracts the veteran photographers that are sort of looking for a new special location. So you guys
definitely
got first crack at it.
Without a doubt.
In the chat, there was Jay Shanny's asking was asking whether it was remote triggered and whether it was going to get stepped on. But that's I didn't realize that they'd built hides, semi-underground hides and things like that. That's I had no idea. I thought everything in Africa was out of a Jeep or long lenses.
And there's other ways around it. I mean, to answer the question that had just flashed up, I was physically underground, basically 20-foot shipping container that's been buried, no windows, no mesh, literally 30 centimeters between my fingertips and lens and the baby's feet right there. So I get asked if it affects the animals at all, and it doesn't. I mean, that baby's breastfeeding off its mum with us being, we're not talking loudly or anything, but even if you are talking, they're so used to your presence there. And particularly in this location in Mashatu in the Tule in Botswana, the elephants are extremely relaxed. They haven't had a huge amount of issues with poaching and whatnot up there. And you'll see a very different behavior in elephants in different parks throughout all of Africa. But particularly if you go to areas where there's a lot of tourism, because this is a private concession, you have to be staying at that lodge and driving with those rangers and guides that work there. So you can't just turn up publicly and drive your own car around. Yeah. So for that reason, they've always had distance and respect and whatnot in the way it's managed. Whereas if you look at elephants in, say, the Kruger National Park, where it's tarmac roads and 50 vehicles driving and pushing and beeping their horns for people to get out of the way so they get a view, you'll find elephants there that once you've annoyed one, you'll know about it. They'll be charging at you and chances are they're not going to stop.
Oh, no. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Just quickly, how many people would be staying there at a time? Like, what sort of capacity does a place like this have for guests?
So at this time, Mashatu only had two different camps. So there's tented camp and main camp, which have been around since probably, my first trip to Mashatu was in 2007, and they'd been open since probably early 2000s. So they had tented camp, which is basically a timber deck with a canvas tent, an outdoor shower and bathroom. Fairly basic, but you're in the bush with no fences, no nothing. You're very, very wild experience. Whereas main camp, you've got larger concrete wall chalets, air conditioning, a bit more comfort. But I think during COVID, they had a new lodge called Euphorbia Lodge in Mashatu, which has only opened last year, but due to COVID, and that is their high-end, top-end lodge. So between them, there's only 8 rooms at tented camp. So at any one time, if they were at full capacity, you'd have 16 guests. Whereas main camp, from memory, have about 16 rooms. Okay. And then Euphorbia Lodge is very, very high-end. So I think they've only got maybe 10 chalets, but these things have got their own plunge pools on the deck per chalet, and they are phenomenal. So the price range obviously differs, but the beauty is, if it's just a place to lay your head at night and eat some food, I'd personally, up until, I haven't been to Euphorbia Lodge yet, and we are taking guests there in November this year, but I've preferred tented camp personally. I just like, it's humble, it's basic. When you get out on a game drive, you're in the same vehicles, in the same land, with the same access. But
it's literally just your accommodation that changes. Your experience in terms of what you're going to see and do isn't changing.
No. Okay. So there's no priority in different areas of land where people at main lodge can only go, for example. Yeah. So there's no limitations in that respect. But the way it is managed is, you'll have all of the vehicles from all 3 camps. The concession is massive. You can drive for hours and you're still within their concession. Yeah. And for that reason, you've got different territories for lions, you've got different territories for leopard, and it's probably one of the best locations in 18 years of traveling to Africa for leopards, particularly. Very relaxed, particularly female leopards generally are going to be more relaxed because they hold smaller territories, whereas male leopards will cross over larger territories. So if they're in a territory where another leopard might be, they don't want to be seen and they want to move on really quickly. Whereas you find the females here, they'll walk by your car and sit on a termite mound making eye contact with you from 2 meters away without a care in the world. Wow. But so how sightings are managed, you're going to have, 10 or 12 vehicles on that property at any given time. They're all in radio contact. So if you come across something that's going to be of interest, it gets radioed in. All the other cars, then whoever finds the sighting manages the sighting. So if they're first on scene, then they'll only have 3 vehicles at a sighting, and then they get rotated in and rotated out. So sometimes being the first to find something isn't always an advantage. Yes, you sort of get first dibs before other vehicles turn up, but if they're hunting and then you get rotated out for another vehicle so they can come and see, and then you miss the action. That can tend to happen, but I find that's more an issue in properties that have way more rooms. You can get to lodges that have, 30 rooms, and you've got so many vehicles out and so many different customers that have to be taken into account to get a view.
Yep.
Whereas at Mashatu, especially when we're with photo groups, our vehicles, we book privately. So there's no other guests outside of our group in the cars. So our priorities are all linked. We're not there with another guest that's like, oh, can we move on board?
Yeah,
so the priority for us is photography, and the photographic groups, when we're on site, take priority on the best light, the best sightings, the best time. Whereas your general tourist, they'll get rotated out for us when it's photographically rich. So we do have an advantage in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah. Because they're not too worried about it being good light. They just want to see. They just want to see animals, and
pretty much.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow.
And that is really the big difference between going on, say, a photographic tour versus going on your own accord as a tourist.
Yeah.
And I know for me, the first 2 trips that I did to Africa on my own, you end up in a car with a complete stranger that you don't know. And on your first day, everything with 2 eyes and a heartbeat, you want to stop and you want to see it. And even if the light's not great, you're just excited.
Yeah.
So what tends to happen is you might go, say, 3 nights in one lodge, then you go to the next lodge for 4 nights. And then by the time you're 3 or 4 days in, you're not going to stop for a zebra or an impala. You're going to move on and find something a bit more exciting. But if you move to the next lodge, say day 4, you move to a new lodge and you get put in a vehicle with people that's their first day in Africa, they want to stop for everything. And that is the major difference, where we all start as a group in the one vehicle. You've got a whole row of seating to yourself. You've got plenty of room to move around, and you don't have to, the driver and the guide aren't there trying to make everyone happy. If we move on, we move on. If we want to stay, we stay, and we make the call on what we're up to. Yeah.
Yeah. So everyone's goals are much closer aligned. Obviously, people are going to have different feelings. Even photographers on the same trip some might want to stay, some might want to go, but it's got to be a lot tighter consensus than if you're there with just a completely random group of people. And then, like you say, even worse, it's your second week traveling around Africa, and it's their first day.
Yeah.
Very, very different levels of what you're trying to find, and excitement levels and things. Yeah.
Definitely. And there's reliable, like going back to different territories with leopard and other things, especially if something's denning. So if you look at hyenas or wild dogs, if they're denning, we've got the ability that if I've got, say, 12 customers, 3 vehicles, that will rotate people through in different days, and we don't change what guests are in which car. Because I'll rotate through cars, so I'll generally have myself in one vehicle, one of my business partners in another vehicle, and then the guys from C4 that I operate with in South Africa, one of their guides in the third vehicle. So the guides will rotate, but the guests will stay in the car with the guests that they started with, and that way, this morning this car saw this thing, then the afternoon anyone that didn't go and see it from a different vehicle can. Whereas if a customer was to change vehicles, it's like, oh, well, I didn't see it this morning. Can I go back? Well, we all saw it. We don't want to go back. So
exactly.
Yeah. That's the way I personally manage. Yeah.
By chance, one person might end up on missing all of these great experiences because they kept getting rotated into a car that wanted to do something different. Yeah. Very interesting.
And FOMO can change the dynamics of a group pretty quickly. It only takes somebody, and look, the Hyatt is a prime example where you get this shot here. You can fit a whole bunch of people in there if you wanted to, particularly now that it's 2 20-foot ship containers. So I generally wouldn't put any more than 8 customers in there at a time.
Yeah.
So if I have 12 customers, then 2 vehicles go to the Hyatt in the morning, 1 vehicle's on game drive. Then the next day, those people will go in the morning. The mornings are generally better than the afternoons. Yeah. And, they're not guaranteed to show up. During the dry season, they will, because it's pretty much the last reliable section of water. Whereas as soon as there's been some rain or there's still pockets of water in the riverbeds, the elephants will just drink there, and there's no reason for them really to come here. And it's been strategically placed because it is a migration path where they'll go between food and water. So it was a very reliable location to actually install a hide to begin with, knowing that we call them elephant highways. You'll just see these tracks. They'll use those same paths for 20, 30 years, the migration paths. Yeah. So, in that regard, you can get a really amazing sighting. And then the people that were on the game drive, you all get back for brunch and everyone's like, oh, did you get the elephants? And this particular one, I'll go back to this story just to elaborate a bit more on it. we had probably this was on the third morning of staying at this lodge on, day 3, essentially. That was my first day in the hide. So I had, the guys that I work with took guests in the first morning, and then the second morning. And then I was allocated to take my car in on the third morning. So the first 2 mornings, no elephants turned up. So everyone would get back to the lodge for brunch, and then, did you get them? Did the elephants turn up? Everyone's all buzzing with excitement. And you could read it on their face that they didn't see elephants. So, we were in there that morning, and we got mud splashed all over us. Like, I was literally up to my face and everywhere covered in mud. So we all said, let's get in the car. Let's just put your jackets on. We'll get back to the lodge. Just try and act like you're a bit bummed out. And they said, did you get elephants? Then one by one, we all just took our jackets off. We had mud sprayed all over us. They go on, you've got them, you got them. So luckily we were there for 5 nights. So all the guests, pretty much every morning from day 3, we got similar sightings. So everyone got the pictures.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. It would be, and obviously you can't guarantee this stuff. Like they're wild animals, but it would be sad if you were sort of there for that and you were the unlucky group that it didn't happen for.
Yeah.
But I assume the way that you design these trips, they may not experience that exact thing, but no doubt across their trip, they're going to experience something special somewhere along the lines that maybe someone else doesn't experience. So hopefully there's enough opportunities that you're going to come home with something special.
Oh, it always happens. You've got 3 cars out at once, and we do split up for the fact that you've got, 3 cars out looking and finding this stuff. Yeah. And, you can have a morning where you've had amazing sightings in the hide, and then the game drive vehicles that were on game drive instead of the hide that morning, they got a leopard kill. They got, something that everyone in the hide can feel a bit bummed out. But once you get that out of your system and you realize that, you're in no control of it, we're in no control of it, then, it's unlikely that you're going to get that same sighting again. Yeah, even me, I've had sightings where I've been lucky enough to witness some stuff that I've never seen again. And there was some pictures on last year's trip, at the end of last year, that we had some bat ear fox kits, which are their babies, that had been washed out of. There was basically a culvert over one of the roads between the property where there'd been no rain at all for a year. And there was heavy rain this morning, and the parents had put the kits inside of this culvert under the road, and they got washed out. So these things were literally, they would be smaller than the palm of my hand. They were tiny.
Really?
And 5 of them shivering in a little ball on the ground, and the parents were freaking out, just trying to find somewhere to put them in cover. Yeah. And generally, you're never going to see them that small. Bat-eared foxes, even to see the adults, is pretty hard and rare. They're quite skittish. Yeah. And these things, I've probably got some pictures as we go through later. We can talk a bit more about it. But that I know I'm not going to see bat-eared fox kits that young ever again. It's pretty hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, you just happen to be there. Yeah.
Yep. Right place, right time. And I just think for me, while you can feel a bit defeated and deflated when you see someone else that got some shots that you didn't get, but I get that out of my system. I have no expectations going in. Whatever happens, happens. For me, my priority is ensuring that the customers get the shots anyway. So, I've been lucky enough to do it for 18 years straight, but, there's never a year where I go over going, another year in Africa. It's not work to me. Yeah.
Seen it all before.
Yep. No. The day you've seen it all, then, something will pop up to remind you that you haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, going back to that first year, that first trip, so you saved up and you planned a trip and you went over there by yourself?
Yep.
Yep. And it was purely for your own joy, your own photographic trip. Was it to build a portfolio, or was it purely just, I just want to see and take photos of animals? It
was just that. I have dreamt about it and I just want to go and see it. So, I was basically going to travel agents. I had for probably 3-4 years before I decided I'm going to do it. I'd still kept them year on year, every single brochure and catalogue from Flight Centre on Africa, and just addicted to looking through this, right? So essentially, if you plan a trip to Africa, and much like my first experience, this pretty much rings true for most people, it's deciding where to go. And a lot of the time, people will be of the opinion, oh, well, it's going to be once off. I'll probably never get a chance to go back. So I just want to try and see and do it all.
Yeah.
And that can be a mistake, because I can guarantee you'll be trying to plan when you're going back while you're sitting at the airport before you've left the country. It's that addictive. Yeah. And you're basically faced with the option between East Africa, which is Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda mostly, and South Africa. So Botswana, South Africa, Namibia would be your top choices, right? So to try and do South and East in one trip, A, you're going to be made of money. B, you need a hell of a lot of time. So it's a choice between one or the other. So I know for me, if you see most documentaries and the stuff that really influenced me early on, and even today, you see most documentaries on Animal Planet and whatnot, it's generally based around the migration. So Tanzania in the Serengeti or the Masai Mara in Kenya. So that was an option for me. And then I figured if I'm going all that way, I may as well do the gorilla trek while I'm there. So it was essentially a 5-day itinerary just for gorillas. It's pretty much a day and a half, almost 2 days to get from Kampala up to Bwindi, where the gorillas are in Uganda. You can also see them in Rwanda and other countries, but I chose them on the Botswanan side. For a reason back then was a lot of political unrest and whatnot that would happen around Rwanda at the time. Uganda's generally a safer bet. While it's not guaranteed, it was generally a safer bet. And getting in, getting out, you're pretty much there for one night, do the gorilla trek, then turn around and drive all the way back again.
Yeah.
And then from there, flying into Kenya to Nairobi. And it was basically pitch your own tent, help cook and clean. It was like one of those participation overland trips. So, on there with 30 other people in a giant big 4-wheel drive bus that you could slide open the windows. Like everyone would have a window seat. And then if you stood on the seats, there was a pop top, like a canvas roll top. So you could stand up at the top of the bus. But you're so high off the ground that you're shooting down on everything. There was really no option to get amazing shots. But at the same token, I think that was probably about $3,000 or $4,000 all-in trip versus, the way I'm doing them now is we're chartering our own private aircraft and flying customers in and, doing it on the luxury way. It'd be hard to go back to doing the overland stuff again, but, everyone's got a budget. So, yes, Africa's expensive, but it doesn't have to be. But all I can say is for the money, the experience is chalk and cheese difference. And it comes back to what I was talking about earlier between national parks, where you have to stick to the road and you've got every other member of the public driving in there, versus private concessions like Mashatu here, where if you're staying there, you're being driven by guides and trackers. And the work that those guides and trackers do, they know these animals' behaviors. They sit and follow footprints and they literally find these things for you. Whereas you could save money, jump in a car and self-drive and have no idea what you're looking at or where to find them or what to do. And that's really the big difference of where you can travel and what you would do. Yeah.
Interesting. And that's separate to the fact that what you do actually you're with a photographer as well. So there's the option of sort of self-guided versus heading somewhere where you're going to get, I guess, taken care of and there's a smaller amount of people. And then the next step again is specifically booking onto a photography tour as opposed to just going to you could go to a private reserve, a private lodge, not on a photography tour. And that's, so you'd find even if you don't need the advice, you can be a confident photographer with your gear. You've done wildlife photography before. Signing up on a photographic tour, it's not about I'm a beginner and I need to learn something. Even if you're advanced, there are advantages to it. For the reason that, again, if you were to travel on your own accord to the same lodge, paying the same money, you're going to be put into a vehicle with a complete stranger unless you book that vehicle privately. So if it's just you, you're paying for all the other empty seats in the car. So you'd be paying upward of nearly $1,500 US per day to book the vehicle privately. And that's what I do. So I book 3 vehicles privately for our group for the 2-week trip in 3 different camps. Right.
So by the time you split that over 4 people in each car, it's significantly cheaper than going yourself and booking that car privately on your own. Look, if you can afford it, by all means, then you don't have to worry about the needs of anyone but yourself. But that's going to be a bloody expensive trip.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
like you say, like, I mean, even someone, I mean, even if you're a skilled photographer, even an expert photographer, I'm assuming if this is your first trip to Africa, you may not be necessarily an expert wildlife photographer. Maybe
Yep.
you are. So there is that element as well. I mean, you've been doing it for 18 years. I'm assuming it doesn't matter how good I am with a camera. There's probably something you'll be able to help me with
Yeah,
while we're over
definitely.
there. You know, like it's not just a matter of can you operate a camera when you're photographing wildlife. So
Yep.
yeah,
A lot of it is preempting situations and animal behavior. You can basically be a walking instruction manual for the camera that you use, but until you've been in that position, you've seen that behavior and you know what to expect. It's the type of thing that you could be on a sighting, looking one way, taking one picture, and everyone else in the car, everyone's going to come back with completely different pictures pointed at the same thing.
yeah,
So it's being able to at least point out, all right, guys, you've got some shots, particularly if you find very first light versus very last light. And it's the case of, getting to really late afternoon, the sun's just gone below the horizon. You're pushing 10,000 ISO trying to get, wild dogs are a prime example, as they'll take off and start hunting at last light in the afternoons.
yeah,
And they move quickly. I mean, you're driving at 60 to 80 Ks an hour, full speed, bumping around. You're not going to get still shots.
yeah,
So, you hit the brakes for a second while these things are running after a small herd of impala. So I'll recommend shoot slow motion pans. Just drop your shutter speeds to a 15th of a second or a fifth of a second and get something dramatic and different. Otherwise, you're going to end up with, 300 pictures of bursts of wild dogs running at 2,500th of a second at 12,800 ISO that when you get back, you're going to delete because they look like rubbish. So
yeah.
it's just knowing if the light's not on your side, you can still create a great picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the only way you know that is you've been there and done it before. When it is your first time, you're probably so caught up in the moment, you're just trying to get something, and you're not thinking about the options that are there photographically. You're just
exactly.
excited. A couple of good questions coming in the chat. From Jay Shanny, would the best starting point be to identify the animals that you're after and then research sort of the specific trip, location, and guides from there? How do you go about that side of it?
Look, I mean, if you had a priority for a particular species, then there are locations that are better known or are a lot more reliable on finding that species. So as an example, like Mashatu itself for elephant and leopards, it's second to none. Like it is one of the best locations for me in 18 years to get shots like that of ellies, but also to have leopards that are quite easy to find. And a lot of it can come down to the topography of the location as well. So Mashatu is semi-arid, so it's a lot of shale and rock. It's not too dissimilar to, say, the Pilbara. So you'll see a lot of sort of rolling, gentle hills, no big hills and cliffs, a lot of winding riverbeds that for most of the year are completely dry, and then some big trees along the riverbeds, and that's perfect habitat for leopard. They need ambush locations, they need trees, but it's fairly open, so you don't get long, thorny bush where makes it very hard to locate wildlife because you're shooting through grasses and long grasses. So everything's really short, and a lot of succulents and whatnot. So it's all low ground cover. So in a way for photography, really dusty when in dry season. So you get this stunning light and backlit glows from all the dust kicking up. Whereas, the classic open grass plains, if you look at the Serengeti, you can literally stand in the middle of the Serengeti in some spots and turn around 360 degrees and see nothing but horizon.
Yes.
So there's nothing blocking light. There's, no shadows being cast anywhere. And you get that early morning light behind you straight into the eye of cats walking head on into your lens. If they're the type of shots you want to go for. Whereas you'll find some locations, rhino aren't easy to find at the best of times, being that they are under heavy attack from poaching and one of those animals which sadly I can probably predict that in my lifetime will go extinct for that reason. You can't find them in some locations. So they're extinct in a lot of locations. So, wild dogs, again, hard to find. But, if there was one area in South Africa that's really well known for predators, if you wanted to see leopards, lions, cheetahs, wild dogs, and, all the scary stuff with teeth, then a place called the Sabi Sands in South Africa, Sabi. Sabi Sands is probably renowned as one of the predator capitals of South Africa. And then again, naturally, the Serengeti in Tanzania or the Masai Mara in Kenya. But for me, my favorite, I mean, Mashatu definitely is up there for one of the favorite locations to me. But if I could choose one country, if I could only go back to Africa to one country, it would be Botswana.
And really? Why is that?
It's quality over quantity when it comes to places to choose from. So it's very low traffic tourism, but high end. So they don't have a lot of budget options through Botswana, but there's a location in particular where I'm headed back to this year in November called the Okavango Delta, which the only way in and out of these lodges is light aircraft. It's surrounded by water, and you've got all of these little dotted islands of land around that have lodges built on them with their own airstrips. So we've got our own aircraft chartered. It's like a taxi service. You'll stay at this lodge for 3 nights. They'll pick you up, fly you to the next one. Then between the second lodge and the third lodge, we've chartered helicopters. So we'll get doors off for an hour to shoot on the way to the next lodge. So we do it in a way that the transfer itself becomes an experience also. But you're only looking at about a 30-minute flight between some of these camps. But the only way in and out, again, is by light aircraft. So you see nobody out there. It's as wild and remote as you'd probably get in Africa.
Are we talking very, very expensive for a trip like that?
Yeah.
Is that it's right up there in terms of price point?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a type of place that the first trip I did in 2007 to the Okavango Delta, the average would have been for a pretty decent lodge, like a lodge that would be about $1,500 per person per night today would have been about $300 to $400 per person per night back then.
Okay.
So you can imagine the price point for some of the lodges now. I mean, there are places in there that are about $2,500 to $4,000 per person per night.
Wow. Okay. Next level.
Yeah.
Next level.
So you'd probably find the average would probably be about $1,000 a night at most of the lodges there. Yeah.
And how much time would you need in a place like that to really enjoy the experience and see enough of it? Obviously, you're probably going to want to go back every time, like you say, but what would be a good length of stay?
Look, the Delta, I say go to at least 2 different lodges within the Delta if time permits, and I wouldn't stay at any location less than 3 nights.
Yeah.
And why I say that is day one, you have to get there, so you miss the morning game drive. So if you get in, and depending on availability of flights and other things, you might get in around lunchtime. Mm-hmm. Then you get the afternoon game drive. Then day 2, you get the morning and afternoon game drive. Day 3 could be your final morning. You get the morning game drive, you come back, you have brunch, then you leave.
Yep.
So I generally find if you go in for one night, you're only getting the game drive in the afternoon of the day of arrival and then the next morning. So you're only getting 2 game drives for the one night stay. So I'll generally say 3 nights minimum anywhere, but 4 nights for me enables you to really unpack and relax. Yeah. Whereas there's nothing worse than doing 2 nights because you just get there and then you're packing your bags and going somewhere else. And that is quite often, going back to the point I made earlier about people go, this is probably going to be my only trip, and they try and fit everything in. Yeah. And you spend, of a 2-week trip, you're probably spending 5 days in transit. Yes. And then you're getting half days at most of these locations. So, and you'll have days where you had a quiet game drive that morning. If that was the only day, then your experience of a place that's really well known for just having nonstop action, not every game drive is going to turn out that way. You could go 4 or 5 days without seeing a leopard or a lion. And, one of the first questions I ask when I turn up to the lodge is I'll go straight to the head rangers or the guides, a lot of them who I know personally from years of working with them. And I'll just say, what are the updates with the resident lion prides? When did they last kill? Because if they've just had a kill within a day, they're going to be flat out of sleep for 2 days digesting. They're not going to do anything. Yeah. So that helps you prioritize. So if I'm here for 3 or 4 nights, I'll go, okay, well, the lions haven't eaten. Let's prioritize that this morning or this afternoon. Yeah. Because there's a high chance we'll get them hunting because they have to eat. Whereas some of the resident leopards, if they're denning and have got cubs, then it's reliable to find them in that location. So there's no real desperation if there's something that would take a high priority over. For me, if wild dogs are in the area, go, because they have massive territories and they'll be in the concession for whatever time it takes them to cross it, and they're out, and they may not come back through for another couple of days or weeks.
Right.
So it really depends, and it's the type of thing everyone's excited to see something, but if it's going to be easy and common to get, then it just helps to draw on that experience to give the confidence to my clients that just let's prioritize this sighting, especially if someone's come across something. It's like, come and get this now because there's a chance that you won't get it again. And again, drawing on that level of experience to ensure that you're getting that for your clients is my job while I'm there. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, especially if maybe the feeling in the early days of the trip is, oh no, we want to find a line, or we want to do this, to have you saying, look, no, let's focus on this. This won't happen again. Like, let's go. Yeah. Because otherwise, without that knowledge and experience there, you could sort of trick yourself into, I don't know, the FOMO side of things, and prioritizing maybe something that you could go and do tomorrow.
Yep. Not only that, it's bringing them back to earth as well, because a lot of the time they'll be floating with their heads in the cloud because they've got a sighting of a line for the first time.
Yeah.
And I haven't even picked up my camera, and they'll be like filling memory cards and, oh man, you must have seen a lot of lines. You haven't taken a picture yet. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't need a picture of the back of a lion's head.
Yeah.
So if you stop, and this is usually day one, first sightings, and then you'll say, we've got the ability to move this car wherever we like. And quite often on any sighting, for me, it's about the quality of the sighting, but it's the quality of your foregrounds, backgrounds, and what the light's up to, which for any photography, light's priority one. So quite often you'll drive into a sighting and everyone's got blinkers on. They're just looking straight ahead. There's the line. I'll be looking behind us and everywhere else to say, position the car here, because I'd rather that background than what we've got right now. So whereas everyone's just yelling, stop the car, and everyone starts shooting frantically, and I'll be like, okay, get this out of your system, because look at the shot you can get from there. And then what I generally do then is, once we're back and we download images in between game drives, there's not a whole lot to do. Some lodges, you go for a swim, and the first couple of days, everyone's just soaking up the knowledge. They're bringing out their laptops and doing editing. After about the third day of getting up at 4:30 a.m., you get back after brunch, everyone goes for a sleep for 2 hours. So in that time, I generally find, day one, after that first game drive, it's just looking at everyone's images and just identifying if there's some problems. Are the shutter speeds too low? Is there some AF problems? Is there a custom function that's been set in the camera that's causing them some issues? It's identifying that, but it's also going through just to point out, okay, you're doing a lot of this, but not a lot of that. Have you considered using this lens instead?
Exactly.
So it really gets everybody on the right playing field in day one. Then my job becomes a lot easier from day two onwards if you knock all that out first, because I've always told customers, I can't fix what I don't know about. So if you're sitting in the car thinking, oh, I've had enough of this, like, why are we doing this again? Say it. Come to me after a game drive, pull me aside if you don't want to talk about it in front of everybody else. But in general, it's the golden rule is, if you have a question, the worst thing you can do is hold on to it.
Yeah, exactly. And you only get out of a trip or a teacher or anything what you put into the experience. So if you're just kind of just sitting back and just letting things happen when you've really got questions, or you're not sure about something, or your gear's not working, you got to get involved and ask questions and get help.
But it's just being tuned into that as well. I mean, there are a lot of people that have jumped into this industry for the wrong reason. There are a lot of people that, they run photographic tours, so their customers are paying their way to have an experience for themselves. And, reputations last and run out very quickly based on how you behave on those type of trips anyway. But that's what I do. I've always made it a point at day one. This is why I'm here. I can't fix what I don't know about. And as much as I can share the knowledge on what I do, people learn, and everyone shoots differently. So, you will find, even I will pick up new things and new experiences on trips, and it's just sharing that, passing that knowledge on. And, I was talking to somebody even just the other day that was talking about how different the approach is, particularly in the professional industry. I mean, my background has been working in the professional photographic industry with Canon, working with Canon Australia for 14 years, working with Nikon for 5 years, both of which was managing NPS, so Nikon Professional Services and Canon Professional Services. So over those years, not only in wildlife photography, I've been working with the best of the best professional photographers, and giving that advice and hearing how these people do it.
Yes.
And it's a lot of that. I've found there's a lot of techniques that I draw on outside of wildlife photography that can come into play. And really, if you're not obsessed with light, you're just taking record images. You're not creating the best picture that there is. And again, It's just moving. And I see this a lot, even if you just look at, say, street photography. A lot of people just get used to seeing a subject of interest to photograph, and they forget that they have feet. They try and fix everything by zooming in rather than moving. And, I've always said a small movement will make a bigger difference.
Yeah.
And, nothing could be truer, particularly with wildlife as well. Not only is it foreground, background and light, but it's just moving. I'd rather have 50 different images out of a 20-minute sighting than to be sitting in the same spot with the same lens with a card full of shots that look identical.
Yeah, once you've got it, you've got it. Unless you're waiting for that perfect moment of a wildlife experience that's about to happen, that's different. But yeah, once you've got the shot, change it up, change your lens or change your situation in relation to lighting and things like that.
And it's knowing... Sorry, I was just going to add one more point to that. It is knowing when to move, because, again, you get lions after the really good first morning light. As soon as it starts getting warm enough, they're just going to be flat out asleep in the shade. They're not going to get up until the afternoon. So having that pressure of turning up, let's just wait, something might happen. There's a point where it won't, and it won't, and being able just to move on. Yeah.
Yeah. Make the call. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And that just comes with experience. Yeah. Yeah,
definitely.
I do have a question on what we were just talking about with regards to gear and moving around before we do. Just shout out to Jethro in the chat. Thanks, Jethro, from over at the Sullavan podcast. Appreciate it. You talked about moving around and not just zooming in and out from the same spot. I used to shoot Nikon DSLRs and sort of evolved into, I shot Canon before that anyway, long story. When I was shooting Nikon, ended up shooting a lot of prime lenses. That was when I was doing a lot of wedding photography, but that then spilled out into everything else I did, sports. I was shooting primes for most things. I was often shooting 28mm, 20mm, and then on the longer end, I'd shoot a lot at 105. I had a 105 1.4 that I loved. Obviously not wildlife stuff because none of that's long enough, but for sports and things, they were actually really fun lenses to shoot with. And then when I switched to Canon, to the RF system, I pretty much went all zooms. I thought it would simplify my kit, pretty much 3 lenses, off I go. I got a really good coverage, great quality lenses, lightweight. But I feel like maybe I've lost a little bit of that. I used to move around a lot more. I used to search for compositions and light a lot more. When I just had the 28mm on, I'd always be moving around. And now I feel like I just zoom in and out a bit more. Do you shoot, other than your long telephotos, do you shoot mostly zooms from the flexibility? How do you retain that mindset of searching for compositions if you're using zooms all the time?
Yeah. So I've always said zoom lenses make photographers lazy. And while that's true, if you're aware of it, then it can be the opposite. It actually gives you more options. So,
Correct.
It can be the Achilles heel having the wrong lens on when something happens. Mm-hmm. And, I'd hate to have a mid-range lens on, say, my R3, which is what I favor for my longest lens. So I do use the RF 600 f4. Mm-hmm. So there's only 2 prime lenses that I reach for on any of my trips when it's wildlife based, and that's my 600mm and the 100mm macro.
Okay.
But 100mm macro, I'm only using it as a macro lens. So there's not a point where I'm throwing that on for 100mm for anything else, because I'll just use my 24 to 105 for that range. Mm-hmm. So look, out of a vehicle is different to on foot. So on foot, you don't really have the option in Africa. There are some locations like Mana Pools in Zimbabwe is one place where you can get out on foot, but for a better part, you're shooting from a vehicle. So different countries, different rules. So most Southern African locations will have no roof on the cars. It's just, think of a Toyota Land Cruiser with the roof cut off. Whereas you'll find in Kenya and Tanzania, predominantly will have Land Rovers with roofs and then the pop tops. You'd stand up out the top, or they're modified cabins. They got really big windows that open that you can shoot out the side. Okay. But between that and lenses, I'll generally travel with minimum of 2 cameras for more than one reason. Reason one, you want to have a medium range and a long lens on at all times. So if you're not close enough, you've got one option. If you're too close, you've got another. But I'll generally work with 3 camera bodies personally. So I'll have a 16 to 35 or the 15 to 35 on my R5.
Yep.
Then with the R3s, I'd have the 100 to 400 and then my 600. So at any given time, you can fill the gaps in your focal range. And particularly where you get animals that will come right up to the car, having a 15 to 35, and I use the Canon Connect app and just put a beanbag on the ground. So again, walking elephants in Mashatu. So going back to those elephant paths I was talking about earlier, if you know they're coming in that direction, they're going to walk along that same path. So you get ahead of them. I jump out of the car, throw the camera on a beanbag, connect it to the app, and then just sit in the car at distance with a 15mm lens as they walk through. And I've actually got some footage of me taking those shots where this female is just walking along. They're about, I'd say, 35 odd elephants. The first ones walked past, didn't even stop, didn't even look at the camera. And this camera would have been probably 2 meters from their feet.
Oh, wow.
And next minute, this one female stops, and you can see her looking straight down the lens with interest, taking a couple of steps towards it. And you can hear the other guests in the car going, oh, my God, they're going to crash your camera. And you can hear, I'm just like, oh, hopefully not. But it was raining. The camera's out in the ground in complete open on a migration path with elephants walking through it. But the shot was worth it. I got it, and the camera's unscathed. So, primes, they're a bit limiting for wildlife. I mean, a 600mm is great, particularly, birds. You've never got a long enough lens when it comes to birds. But, having those options, and, if you are using a prime and you need to get closer, depth of field and compression comes into what lens to use and why, because you could get close enough at 400mm, and you could get tighter with 600, but you're also going to have a lot shallower depth of field to play with. So if you're trying to decide which lens to reach for, you need to consider depth of field as well. Because if I had, say, a herd of elephants at close to infinity distance away, then I don't have to worry so much because I know my depth of field is going to be covered because it's at infinity. Whereas if it's at a closer focusing distance, you need to stop down a lot more to get them all in focus. So the wider your lens is, the closer you are, the more depth of field you're going to have. So a lot of the time, if you're setting up shots, it really depends, because if you want to compress and drop the background, then go at distance, use a longer lens. Whereas if you've got the luxury of getting closer and throwing something on that's a little bit wider, it's a bit more forgiving for depth of field as well. So it really does come down to what are you trying to achieve out of your shot. And again, having those options in private reserves means you can drive off-road.
Yes.
And that's why I will only go into private concessions for that reason. Because if you can't get off-road, you're only going to get as close as the road permits. Yeah,
that's right. And then obviously, the more gear you've got, the more reach, the more options, the better that experience is going to be, because you're limited by basically being on a train track to go through the okay. So gear wise, you probably take a lot with you as well, more options than what you just talked about. What do you recommend someone that's coming on one of these trips for the first time? What do you tell them they should take as a minimum requirement, assuming they're they've got a reasonable kit? What would you sort of let them know? Hey, you got to have this, otherwise you're going to have a fairly terrible experience over here.
So I'd say, look, again, there were the 2 reasons you'd take 2 bodies, and the first was 2 lenses, 2 options without changing lenses, because it gets dusty and you just don't want to do it. But second to that, if you take 1 camera body and that fails or it gets dropped and smashed, your trip's finished as far as photography is concerned. So, look, I'd say at a minimum, 100 to 400 would be at minimum what you'd want to take. Like a 70-200 just would not reach enough.
When you say 100 to 400, are you using the EF 100 to 400, or are you on the RF 100 to 500 yet?
I'm still using the EF 100 to 400. I find it as fast for focus. I find it as sharp. And at 400mm on both lenses, you're working with a wider aperture on the EF than you are on the RF version.
I thought that was the case. Yeah, it stops down quicker, doesn't it, than the EF? And then obviously you've got the benefit of being able to go all the way out to 500. But yeah, at 400, it's, what's it at, like
5.6.
5.6. Yeah, already. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So look, the 100 to 400, the EF at 400 mils 5.6, whereas you find the RF 100 to 500, it's probably about 6.3. You know, it's a third of a stop. It's not a whole lot, but a third of a stop in shutter speeds and a third of a stop in ISO. It's not the end of the world.
No.
But having that much more loss between its widest aperture and its longest means you're losing a bit more light.
Yeah. Maybe for me, you know, for someone who's not a primary, you know, not a wildlife photographer, maybe for me, a 100 to 500 would be better because I'm not going to have a 600 mil lens, you know, sitting next to me.
Yeah.
Whereas for you, you've got that option. That's what you're going to go for if you need extra length. So yeah, that probably makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, the other way you look at it too, and I'll get asked that same question a lot. I mean, particularly when I was working for Canon, it was the first thing someone would ask. And even then, I would give my honest opinion, regardless of the fact that, I mean, you know, I'm not going to trash talk any products or any brand anyway. But I've just found a common thing that a lot of people would do before the RF lenses were a thing would be to throw a 1.4 converter on top of the 100 to 400, which means then you're getting to 640 at f8.
Yep.
When you've got it on. So if you look at the fact that you're getting to 500 without a converter at 7.1 out of the 100 to 500 RF, I find you've got just a little bit more flexibility in the EF 100 to 400. And if you need more reach, throw a converter on and you've got 640 f8.
Yep.
So that's where I decided it wasn't worth the investment in the 100 to 500 when that range for me, 100 to 400, sits between my 600 mil. And I'll quite often throw 1.4 converter on top of my 600 if I need really big lengths. So particularly with birds. But again, you can have locations, even though you can drive off-road, you might have a sighting. There's just no way you're going to cover that distance before the sighting moves off. Or there's a river in between you and that subject, or there's rocks or a cliff or something that you can't get around. Then having that extra reach comes into play. But I'd say that the only RF lens that I wasn't hell-bent on needing would be the 100 to 500. I've certainly found the 100 to 400 EF2, not the original. So the original Series 1, what I used to call the dust pump.
The pump action one.
Yeah, the dust pump. That thing was not only slow, I just found it horrifically soft. It was never a sharp lens.
Yeah. It didn't get great reviews.
No.
Yeah.
So much so that, you know, even the whole time I worked at Canon, I'd never used it because I knew it wasn't a great lens. Yeah. And I'd honestly say for probably the first year and a half to 2 years of the Series 2 coming out, I still didn't touch it. I was using a 70 to 200, and back then I had a 500 f4.
Yeah.
Because if I needed extra length, I'd throw a converter onto the 70-200 and would find that focused faster and gave sharper results than the original 100 to 400 EF did.
Yeah.
And again, for nearly 2 years, I just ignored the 100 to 400 Series 2. And then I took that on a trip to Africa and it was like, man, this thing's insanely sharp. So, of course, the first thing I did when the 100 to 500 came out was I just wanted to see if it was worth the upgrade. And in my personal experience, I don't think it is.
Yeah. Is it the only adapted lens you're still using? Is that the only EF
no.
lens you're using with the system? Okay.
So I've still got, you know, some of the really fancy prime stuff. So the 24 1.4, the 35 1.4, you know, everything else like 16 to 35's replaced with the RF 15 to 35. My 24 to 105, I'm using the RF version now. But, you know, the 7200 I still haven't upgraded, which I'd like to. You know, there's jobs commercially at home here in Melbourne. You know, I don't do a lot of wildlife photography around Australia. Yeah, I do Kakadu and I'm headed back there in June with some customers. But for a better part, outside of those locations, there's not a lot of wildlife photography in Australia for me that holds my interest. So the 7200 doesn't get a lot of use, but shooting, you know, corporate work and commercial jobs and music, then the 7200 does its thing. And look, just a couple of weeks ago, I was shooting the Smashing Pumpkins show. And just reminded me of how heavy that lens is.
Yeah, when you carry it around for a little while, you start wishing for that RF version that weighs a kilo or whatever it does. It's so light.
Not only that, it's the packability of the lens, because the 7200, the EF Series 2, you've got to put it in your backpack laying down. So if the size of your backpack, it's taking up that much room.
Yep.
Whereas you can't put it in standing up, whereas the new one you can. So
it's a game changer.
Yeah. That alone for me is why I would upgrade.
Yep. Yep. Or leaving it mounted on a body, it fits in the same spot that it would with any of your other smaller lenses
Yeah,
mounted to it. Whereas, I used to have a spot that would fit my body with the 7200 mounted, and it
yeah,
would take up a heap of room in a camera bag. Yeah.
definitely. And look, I use with camera bags, I'm using the Shimoda bags, and I
Hmm.
deliberately use the DV inserts rather than the DSLR inserts. So the Shimoda bags, much like, similar to f-stop bags, the backpack inserts pull out. So
Yep.
it's a wireframe professional hiking outdoor backpack when you pull the camera insert out. So you
Right.
get sort of two uses out of the bag. But I found the actual inserts themselves, the DSLR ones, are just that little bit shallower, whereas the DV ones, I can fit the lenses standing up rather than laying down. So
Right.
handy hint
And
for anyone.
and does that just make the backpack kind of a little bit more expanded with the bigger insert in it? Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Interesting.
not much, doesn't add extra pressure on the zipper or anything, but
Hmm.
where the laptop sleeve is, it's on the back panel of the door. So if you do have gear standing up, the shorter ones, you'll have the end caps of your lenses sticking out. So when you
Yep.
close the bag, there's nothing stopping the laptop from putting pressure on your gear.
Yep.
Whereas the DV insert reaches the lip of where the laptop sleeve is, so it gives you a bit more protection.
Mm,
So I find
very
it helps with that
interesting.
as well. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. Is that do you use those bags on a trip like if you were going to Africa, do you use those bags as your sort of your main camera bag?
Yep. So
Yep.
working out of the car, I don't use camera bags at all. The camera
Yep.
bag is literally getting my gear on and off aircraft, and
Hmm.
that's pretty much the extent of where I use the camera bags. So in vehicles, the last thing, I mean, you can have a seat next to you where you can pop your camera bag down and zip it up, and your lenses are all safe in there.
Yep.
But the way I personally work in the cars is I'll sit next to the driver in the passenger seat, which leaves the elevated rows for the customers behind. That if they've got questions, I'll just turn to my seat and answer them. Whereas the
Yep.
front seat, you've got the dash in the road, then you've got the
Yep.
aerial, you've got the driver next to you as well. So it's not the optimal seat. So I'll take that and leave the optimal seats for the customers. So
Hmm.
in that regards, because I'm just in a front seat of a car, I don't have anywhere to put a camera bag. So I actually use a camera vest. So I look like
Right.
the tragic tourist sitting there with a shooter's vest on,
Mm.
but batteries, and I don't change lenses really because I've got the 600, 100 to 400, 24 to 105. The only time I'll change a lens out on a game drive is if I've got a big herd of elephants or if
Hmm.
I've got wild dogs coming right up to the side of the car or hyenas right up to the side of the car. Then I'll
Mm.
throw the 15 to 35 on the R5
Yep.
and I'll actually screw the monopod into it, drop it over the side of the car to the ground. And then I'll connect
Ah.
that to my Canon Connect app on the phone. So you can just move the camera around on the monopod, looking at your camera screen on your
Yep.
phone, taking the pictures and getting a composition, moving a focus point, having complete control. And there
Interesting.
was a shot a few years ago that I did before you had Bluetooth connectivity and apps it was probably a 5D Mark III from memory, where I
Hmm.
had some wild dogs come right up to the car. And what I used to do is I used to get a cold shoe adapter and put that on the top of my hot shoe mount in the camera. But then
Yep.
I'd get a tennis ball and cut a little cross into it and force that over the top of the hot shoe adapter. So then you had a tennis ball sitting on the top of your camera. So when you put it upside down with a monopod, you could rest it on the ground without dirt and all sorts of, and literally crap sometimes going all over your camera. And
Interesting.
it anchors it to the ground. So you've got a point of contact. So your hand and the ground stabilizes it.
Yep.
And then I had a really long cable release and I'd sit there and just hope that it was focusing. And so many times it would be focused on the background and not the subject. And it was just hit and miss.
Yeah.
So what I'd do is, 16 mil, I'd just stop down to F8 or F11
Yep.
and I'd pre-focus. So I just hold the camera up, pre-focus and drop it down. And that gave me more luck.
Yep.
But now it's all connected through apps. It's all touchscreen on your phone. You literally touch the subject. You can change all of your settings. And yeah, you come back with some absolute corkers.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
But that
Uh,
is literally the only time I'd change lenses. So the camera vest, if you need to, you've got the 15 to 35 in there because your camera bodies have got
yep.
them. And again, at Mashatu, you've got the photo vehicles as well. So they're like a game fishing chair in the back for the customers. And next to them, they've got a big padded trap case. So you just open the lid, you've got your water bottle and everything in there. It's all padded and dust sealed. And
Really?
yep. And then in front of you, you've got a gimbal, like a Wembley gimbal head. So you can just chuck your long lens on it and have complete support. There was probably photos of it somewhere in the pickies that I sent through of the photo vehicles. But yeah.
I'll see if I can find it. We should, I'll bring up, actually, maybe I will bring up some pictures while we're talking about gear just for fun.
For sure.
But the original, yeah, that's crazy.
So that's
oh, hang on.
That's a picture from the past. So that was, for anyone that doesn't know me from my background, I worked for Canon Australia for 14 years, and for probably 8 years of that, up until 2020, when this team, it was called Canon Collective, were all made redundant due to COVID. We used to run photographic experiences all around the country. So, at that time, there was about 50 different photographic workshops a week happening all around Australia for about 8 years.
I still can't believe that when you said that the other day, after we had a phone chat and you mentioned 50 a week, even after the call, I was like doing the numbers in my head. I'm like, how does that even work?
No one could touch us. Like, we had competitors in the market. We're probably dropping, $2 million a year just on wages for the team. So, I'd never hold it against Canon for stopping it. But Canon Australia were the only company in the world that had Canon Collective. But look, our doomsday plan. So you see Greg there on the left and Scott on the right, the two guys at the ends, are now my business partners with the Photography Workshop Co. So we had a doomsday plan that if all went to hell in a handbasket, that we'd continue doing what we did under our own banner, and that's exactly what happened. And, it's rewarding doing your own thing. Like any freelance work, it's unpredictable. It's stressful not knowing when things are happening. And, we kicked this off in 2020 when we couldn't travel. We couldn't do a thing. So yeah, that was hard.
That's what a time to start a business for photo experiences. But I mean, you made it happen. It's like, I don't know, sometimes you need to be forced into that moment to jump and go for it.
Well, I wouldn't have left under my own steam. In all honesty, that was literally probably a tenth of the gear that we had nationally in our team.
Was it really?
Yeah. When your job was going and doing photo workshops and doing amazing stuff, and you had every single Canon product times 10 on the shelf that you'd pick up at any given time, there's no way I would have left if it was up to me. So, it was hard being made redundant. It was hard leaving security and the money and everything else. And if anything, your identity got stripped off as well. I mean, I'd been Jay from Canon for 14 years. I'd had people that relied on me when I was at CPS. You were dealing with photographers that I was known for what I did because I worked for Canon. So while that was hard to stomach and hard to take, and, it was a bit of a punch in the guts, but I've found, it's been rough for 2 years during COVID, but we're coming out the other end now. And between Greg, Scott, and myself, we're much happier people in general. So,
well, that's good to hear. Yeah. So a tough time, but worked out for the best in the long run. But but I can imagine, being involved just at that level in the industry, like you say, meeting all the photographers that you were able to meet, that sort of experience with gear and from both sides of Canon Collective, so Canon Collective was more of an experience more so with the everyday photographer or people like me, even professionals, but from the point of view of like maybe learning something new or meeting people or whatever, whereas your time at CPS was specifically about supporting professional photographers, pros. Yeah. And helping them do what they need to do, whether it's facilitating gear repairs, gear loans, on-site stuff at events. Yep. You were involved in all of that?
Yeah, definitely. So I managed CPS for about 8 years with Canon Australia. So with that, it was being on site at Formula One, the Australian Open, MotoGP. Yep. So all of the major press-covered events in the country, you'd be on site with backup gear and on-site repair. Mm-hmm. And it's not just Canon Australia, that's a global thing. There's CPS that exists in every country, all through Europe, US, Asia. Nikon do the same thing. So before working at Canon, I used to do the same job for Nikon. So, getting to see that was dealing with all of the press photographers, all the major newspapers, Olympics, Commonwealth Games, World Cups, all of it is covered. So every year when the Olympics comes around, there's always, if you look at DP Review and all of the the online sites, every year they're waiting to see the gear cupboard from Canon. And you've got like 60 600 f4s and 200 R3s lined up on a shelf. Yeah. That's what we used to do. Yeah.
So tell me this, because obviously, Nikon versus Canon, there's so many things. It's the age-old feud, even though, Sony's there, but no one cares. Nikon versus Canon. If you're at the Olympics and MPS was going to have a wrestling match with CPS, who would win? Who's the winning team?
Knowing the performance of the R3, I think it's hard to beat. I mean, the AF systems in the R3, people are generally saying that between Canon and Sony are leading the race as far as autofocus systems are concerned, and that Nikon still has just been edged out by it. And look, while I haven't extensively used the Z9, I have got a very good customer based over in Perth that was on a trip with me last year in Kakadu that had the Z9. That was the first time I'd physically seen and used one. And look, coming from a background, I used Nikon for the first 10 years and worked for them, obviously, for that time. But back then, when I was working for them, Canon ruled the world. Sony weren't even on the scene. They didn't exist in the SLR land. I mean, they never existed in the SLR land anyway. They were mirrorless from day one. But when it came to performance, I mean, Nikon were just so far behind Canon. And then they leapfrogged when the D3 came out. And that was at the time when Canon had the 1D Mark III that had the horrendous autofocus issues. And this would have been probably 2011 or 2012 from memory. And what had happened, I was actually part of it when I was working for CPS at the time, and we had maybe 20 loan units, and we had no problems with them. And we're seeing all these people in Europe and the US complaining about all these autofocus issues. And Canon lost a bunch of market share over it. Everyone jumped over to the D3s with Nikon, saying that the autofocus was reliable and it was better in low light. But what it ended up being is the little stoppers underneath the mirror, they were expanding in heat. So when the Mark III, the 1D Mark III came out in Australia, it wasn't during our summer. So I just wasn't seeing it. I had 20 loan units, everyone from Reuters, Getty, AP, News Limited, all of them were using them. No one in Australia was having issues.
Wow.
So roll around January or late January 2011 or 12, we're all day one.
Open.
Yep, Australian Open. And next minute, you're sitting there with nearly 50 degrees off the court of heat. And day one, every photographer's coming in. I mean, I remember, Cameron Spencer, all the big names in Australian sports photography going, all my shots are out of focus. What's going on? Some of them are back focus, some are front focus. There's no consistency to it. And, we had the guy that designs the autofocus systems from Japan and the head of professional business global for Canon Inc. on a plane from Tokyo office there. I had literally my boss at the time, who was Alan Brightman, ring me saying, look, I can't get down to Melbourne for at least 2 days. I'm away on other business. Can you make sure you look after them? So they roll in the clothes that they had on, no other luggage. So, we had to look after and get them a change of underwear, a toothbrush and everything to make sure they were comfortable when they got there. And they literally came in to try and diagnose what the hell was going on, because you had the world's media all using the camera saying what the hell. So it ended up being the stoppers underneath the mirror that were expanding in the heat. So what would happen is the sub mirror would be sitting at a different angle depending on the temperature.
Wow.
So the AF starting point was in front or behind the focal plane. That was the cause of it. So
the issue.
When it came down to it, who would win the battle now at the Olympics? There's no mirror box. There's none of those problems. No. So between the two, I think at the end of the day, the camera doesn't make the photographer. So I'd say depends who's driving.
Wow. Very diplomatic answer there.
Yeah. And look, I've still got good friends on both sides of the fence in the company. And, I'd definitely say that the R3 is still edging out as the better camera right now. I don't think there's anything on the market that even touches it.
Yeah, it's an amazing camera. And I mean, look, I haven't, the issue is, and you probably get to see it because you go on workshops with people that have great kits, so you get to play around with the Z9. I haven't had my hands on that before, and I haven't had a good play with an A1. But yeah, certainly the R3, I don't know, I can't imagine anything with better autofocus, but...
No. And I loaned a bunch of Sony gear last year, actually. So I ended up doing a workshop with Sony and loaned their gear for a couple of months. And I used the A1, and I tried their 100 to 400, their 70 to 200, I believe the 24 to 70, 28, the 16 to 35. Yep. And I just found that the A1 was kind of, neck and neck with the R5. I didn't see it was any better. So to sell everything and start again and reinvest, and I didn't see the point. And the big thing for me was having run CPS. I know what support looks like. Yeah. I know if something goes wrong. I've got a camera today that keeps me working. There is no professional services with Sony. So that for me was one of the biggest linchpins and one of the bigger reasons why I stayed with Canon. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And when you've got that much insight into what support is available for professionals, especially with longer glass and stuff like that, it would be hard to make the choice to jump ship when they don't have that sort of setup in Australia, particularly. Do they have that kind of setup in other countries? Is it just Australia hasn't, or they're just not? It's not something they're focused on.
Professional services. I mean, Canon and Nikon have been doing it for so long. I mean, since the 90s. So it's a massive investment. So, CPS at the time when I was there would have had probably 500-600 mils, probably 400 2.8s. I mean, you're talking good amount of gear that it's going to be unlikely that in any given week that a pro photographer is all going to drop a 400 mil lens at the same time. Yeah. But there was enough there that when major events were on, there was still gear left in Sydney as backup gear for people like all the other CPS members around the country that aren't sports photographers and aren't shooting that event. Whereas you'll find, with Sony, without having professional services and having that level of gear, if they've got one 600 mil and that happens to be out in service replacement loan, what am I going to do? I've just dropped 20 grand on it, which I did. I dropped 20 grand on the 600 f4, and I had the choice of, do I stay with Canon, or do I go for Sony? And to me, it was a no-brainer at the end of the day. I know if my R3 has a problem, they've got a shelf full of them. So, there's a dedicated team that do that, and it doesn't exist with Sony yet. I think it's something that they'd be stupid not to do it to that level, but until they've got enough users, like AP, Associated Press, have now a global agreement. They all use Sony.
Yes.
If you looked at the top, there was Reuters, Getty, AP being the top three. Getty are still pretty much 100% Canon mostly. There are some photographers in Australia that work for Getty that do use Nikon, but it's maybe one or two out of the full-time team in Australia. Then you might get a handful in the US, but their contract is with Canon. Associated Press have that same, and they've got service agreements and everything else in place with Sony as well. But the other thing to touch on as well is that with Canon, you've got employed service technicians that are trained to global standards as Canon. Whereas you'll find a third-party service agent, they will get probably support and training by Sony technicians. Yes. But where Canon Australia, anyway, if we're just going to talk local, they're the same technicians that have worked with Canon for 20, 30 years.
Yeah. They know it inside out. Yep.
Big time.
Yep. And they've been trained. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can... I just thought this probably illustrates your love of Canon quite well.
Well, that was, funnily enough, that was back in 2010. So that was about 2 days after the World Cup had finished in South Africa.
Oh, really?
And funnily enough, Cameron Spencer actually took that photo. So Cameron, if anyone's not aware of who Cameron Spencer is from Getty, his, the shot of Usain Bolt at the Olympics, the slow panning shot with him looking straight down the barrel of the lens.
Yep.
That was Cameron. So he was on this trip after the World Cup had finished. And at the time, the pick editor or the head of Getty in Australia, Stuart Hannigan, he basically asked, can I stay on for an extra 2 weeks and do a trip? So I've got some images that we can put into the archives, because all the stories of the World Cup, they're going to need a picture of a lion and, some other stuff to go in the mix. So he was lucky enough to snag a spot on the trip with me for 2 weeks.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good trip for both of you. It's
no, absolutely. Good memories.
Those sort of things are, once in a lifetime opportunity. So this is what you were talking about with the sort of no roof Land Cruiser.
Yeah.
Shooting out of the back there.
Yeah, so there's,
Wow.
there's nothing stopping. Everyone's like, oh, what if a cat jumps in the car? They don't. They got no interest in you. So
Are you sure?
provided you don't.
Are you positive?
Oh, look, there's no real reported cases of it happening, but look, it's more a thing that they're born and there's vehicles. They're used to seeing them. So it's not a threat and it's no interest to them. So, it comes to a point where if you stand up and you break the silhouette of the car, then they'll pay attention to that. So the golden rule is don't stand up. Don't,
yeah.
They can be right next to the car and you can move, you can talk, and they've heard it all before. They can be asleep and you can sit and, you wouldn't do it, but you could whistle or make some stupid noise. They've heard it all before. They won't even lift their head up. But if you move gravel on the ground, their head's up straight away.
Really?
So if you took one step out of the car, they'd be on you.
Jeez, that is a little scary, I'll be honest. Yeah, a little scary. What about traveling with this kind of gear? I mean, I've traveled to a lot of countries, but with my camera gear, but I usually max out at 200 mils. Like traveling with long glass and 3 bodies. How do you do it?
So for me, it's everyone says just put your camera bag on one shoulder and pretend it's light.
What is
it
yours
does nothing. Look, I think the most I've carried on and once was about 23 or 24 kilos.
Yeah, same. I've done that before, and I was worried the entire time that they were going to ask me to weigh it because you can try and make it look light, but once you get to about 20 kilos, it gets tricky to make it look effortless to put it in the overhead bin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And truth is, as soon as you've got a sizable backpack, that's going to draw enough attention. And I don't use rollers for that reason as well, is that rollers suggest heavy gear and it suggests, can I weigh that? Because you look at any flight, even domestically right now, the amount of people taking rolling luggage on because they don't want to check in, because they just want to get off the plane and get in a cab and leave the airport without waiting for their luggage. Yep. So it looks like luggage, so they're going to ask to weigh it. So what I'll personally do, this was for a Canon trip, so these lenses were given out to customers as well. So that's not all of my gear on that particular lineup. Yep. But what I would commonly travel with now, so if I look at the recent trip to Antarctica would be different to Africa. But if I was to pack to leave for an African trip tomorrow, I actually carry, and I've just got it here, I'll grab it. The new 600 mils come in a soft pouch now with a strap. So like the old ones used to have the hard cases and they were bulky and, you couldn't carry it on your shoulder. Mm-hmm. So because it was a hard carry case, yes, you're allowed to take a small personal item. So for women, like a handbag, for guys, a laptop bag on top of, say, a 10 kilo limit for carry on. So my Shimoda backpack, I'll throw all of the gear in it. I'll carry that over my shoulder as my extra personal item. And if they really wanted to argue, I can say that'll fit under the seat. That's a $20,000 lens. If you wouldn't mind, there's no way I want to check this in. As soon as you start getting rude and defensive, if they're having a shit day, they're just going to force the fact because you're an arsehole. So
exactly,
you've just got to keep that in mind. I just stay polite. Sometimes if you turn up and too polite, they're like, okay, what's this guy hiding? For me, the key is just turn up and be yourself. Just say good morning. If the person before was a bit difficult, you can go, oh, geez. You handle that pretty well, and instantly you're on side. But more and more now, I mean, all the flights going into South Africa now, it's self-check-in. So you're just going to the bag drop and no one's asking to weigh your bag. But look, when I get to the other end, the opposite. Johannesburg's notorious for weighing your stuff because if they can get a bribe out of you, they will. And I've had it so many times. They're like, oh, you open your passport wallet and there's a $10 US note. They're like, oh, I reckon you might be able to get on with, that $10 US. If you pay it, you pay it. But in the end of the day, I'll take the 600 in its own little pouch and then my backpack. Now, the absolute secret weapon, again, is that camera vest. So those pockets are deep enough to fit the R3s and a lens next to it. So I can literally, the contents of a whole pro-sized backpack, 2 bodies, 100 to 400, 24 to 105, 15 to 35 would be my average kit, and then teleconverters will all fit into this. So if I need to, I'll just wear that, because the last thing you want to do is the bag's already overweight, you then don't want to rip that out at the check-in counter and start filling it, because they're like, well, hang on a minute, you're still carrying it on board. What's the difference? You don't want to have the argument. So I'll throw the bodies, lenses, and spare batteries into it. So when they weigh the bag, it's within checked luggage allowance. Then you just get back to the lounge, pack it back in, throw it in the overhead. But where
no one ever looks at you a bit sus when you're wearing a vest that's full of bulgy, hard things?
To be honest, it doesn't bulge out all that much. Like it doesn't look, and you see, you know, a lot of tourists turning up with vests on. They're usually khaki in color. I keep it black.
Yeah.
And I'll wear a black hoodie as well, just so it blends in. It doesn't look too obvious. And I found that works for me personally. But look, it's the type of thing that when you get to the other end, I'd rather work out of something on my body when I'm sitting in the car than opening and closing a bag and having that at your feet and getting in the road. So I find it's just an efficient way to work as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the key is, keep everything looking light and ideally actually light if possible.
Yeah.
By putting a few strategically placed bits of equipment. I mean, I do a similar thing just with a regular jacket. If I'm traveling somewhere, my jacket I carry on just in, you know, on my arm or whatever, and then it usually has some extra stuff in it. I often put batteries in that sort of thing because you got to So I just have a bag full of all the batteries and that kind of stuff, and it's quite heavy, so I'll just throw that in the pocket of a coat. I know that worst case, you know, they're not going to get smashed if I accidentally drop my coat or something like that. So I usually, be a bit strategic about it, and then, similar kind
a
of
different
strategy.
Country, because I've done it in so many places, but I remember 2014 when I was going through Dubai on the way to Kenya, I was already in the airport. So I'd flown Sydney to Dubai and went through all that rigmarole, the camera vest, and I'm like, cool, I'm in the airport. I'm stressed out of my mind until I get through check-in. Because I don't want to check my camera gear, right? I can't relax until I'm through. I'm a nervous wreck. I'm sweating. I'm in a really shit mood because of that. And once you're through to the lounge, then, you know, sit down, have a drink and chill out. But where I got caught out is when I was in Dubai, I just figured, oh, well, I'm in the airport, so it's all good. But if you've never been to Dubai, when you get to the check-in gates, there's actually a big glass elevator and you go down one floor to the check-in gate. And then where the check-in counter is, they've got scales.
Yes, when you go into your gate.
Same
as like Singapore and stuff like that. I've been caught there. The same. Yeah.
And I didn't know because you can't see it. You get either down the escalators or the lift, and you're like, oh crap, they're weighing on the way on. So, you know, you're in clear. There's nowhere to hide. So, you know, you can't just start pulling stuff out of your bag and drawing attention to yourself. So, I paid excess. He said, look, I'll let you carry it on. Just, you know, put it under the seat in front of you because you do have an extra item and, you know, your bag's 15 kilos. You should only have 8 or whatever it might be. So I ended up paying, it was probably like $60 US or whatever it was. But to avoid it, you get to know which airports do what. But I generally find that camera vest, you know, I can have 15 kilos in that alone.
Yeah.
So, and batteries is where most of the weight is. If you look at batteries and lenses, it used to be camera bodies. I mean, I came from using the 1DX Mark IIs, which are heavy, whereas the R3s, they're light as now. So I'll leave the bodies in my bag and put my lenses and batteries in the vest, and that's enough that really reduces enough weight that you don't have that problem.
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk to you about some other workshops soon, but before we get off the topic of Africa, I thought we'll click through a couple more photos.
Sure.
Hopefully, if this works, I assume where is this? Is this in Australia?
That's actually Darwin Botanical Gardens at the end of
I thought so.
Trip. Yeah.
I thought it was. It didn't. Yeah, I was like, I don't think this doesn't look like Africa, but you never know.
That's the crew I work with. So NT Bird Specialists, you'll see in that photo down in the foreground, you got Luke Patterson, who's probably one of the most renowned bird-specific guides in Australia. So his company that I have an exclusive partnership with for all of our photographic tours through the top end. So Kakadu back up there again in November with 12 customers. So that one's all around birds and wildlife. Yeah.
Jeez, you are all over the place. What about this?
That's Namibia. So that's traveling up to Sossusvlei out of Windhoek. So that's probably another half a day drive before getting into Sossusvlei, where Dead Vlei is. You know that pan surrounded by dunes with the dead petrified trees?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so it's on the way up to there. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Canon Collective behind the scenes.
Yeah, back in the day. So I think
Back
that
in
was
the day.
Cape Hillsborough up in near Mackay, I think, up there. So they get the kangaroos that come up at sunrise on the beach there. So it's a bit of a tourist trap. Like everyone's there with selfie sticks and stuff these days. So
Yep.
yeah. And that's in Mashata. That's this location here. But there's a big escarpment up there that you can get up. There's a spot we take the customers usually later on in the trip. And we just go up there for sunset and drinks and canapes. But yeah,
look at that! Look at that sunset. You can just tell it's going to get like orange, or
well, that's the dust.
The sun. Yeah, it's just like the sun's still high, but you can just tell it's going that way already.
Yeah. Well, right on the point, just behind me, you can't see. There's a massive baobab tree that sits on the edge of that cliff.
Right.
So yeah, it's a really, really nice location. Yeah.
Looks like a dream location.
So that's, we don't pile them all into one car, but that was the last Canon Collective Africa tour that I ran under the Canon banner officially, but, obviously doing these as my own business now. But you'll see the fellow down on the left in the black jacket holding the lens up like a Wookiee. That's Andre. So Andre from C4, who is my exclusive ground handlers over there. So I do all my business through them. So he's the owner of the underground hides that gets you into position for those shots.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I didn't realize that. So these tours, they started off as something you would run for Canon Collective, or as part of the Canon Collective thing, or so it was before that even that you started running tours before you were with Canon, or is that when it began?
Yeah.
So
before.
How did it actually? How did the first tour start? How did you go from being the the kid going over to Africa, spend all the money you've saved to go over there and take some photos by yourself, to actually being a guide? How did that happen?
So I was running them on my own before Canon. So I was basically every scrap of my annual leave when I was in CPS, so Canon Professional Services in Sydney. Mm-hmm. So I moved to Melbourne in 2014. To join the Canon Collective team. And the Canon Collective had been going for probably a year and a half or 2 years before I joined the team, but it was very, very different. They used to call it town halling, and it was just putting out things on photo message boards and forums that Canon's coming to this community hall and we've got a presentation. It was death by PowerPoint. It wasn't experiences. It wasn't gear. It was just, here at Canon, we've got a proud heritage of blah, blah, blah. It was boring as batshit. So what had happened is, in that time, I worked in the pro team. I'd worked up through my time at Nikon and got poached by Canon to come over and work in the pro team for them. And I was like, I'm not going to leave Canon pro team to go and work for this consumer junk. And the boss at the time that had come up with the concept of Canon Collective is like, would you come and work for us? I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, I think you could be doing better things. What if we do tours like I already do? And, in my head, I'm like, I want to go and not use my annual leave so I can actually have holidays with my wife for a change instead of, make it work. So he's like, oh, do you think it'll work? And I'm like, say yes and I'll show you. So, we ended up with bigger experiences and tours as a result of that. So it really did turn a corner. I joined at the same time as Greg Sullavan in Queensland, who's now one of my business partners with the Photography Workshop Co. And I know between the two of us, we just sat down when the job offer came through because they wanted to expand the team. And I remember talking to Greg and just saying, what are you going to do? We both worked in the Canon professional team. I'm like, I don't really want to leave the pro team for this. And both of us agreed. It's like, if we can get what we want out of it and we can do better, exciting stuff, then I'd jump over. And it became a whole different beast because of that. So,
do you think maybe Canon saw the writing on the wall as far as pro photographers being certainly not a dying breed, but in terms of newspaper photographers and things like that, it was shrinking. So moving resources, extremely skilled and experienced people like yourself, moving them from, rather than being pro support, but really engaging with passionate amateurs and experiences, was a way for Canon to kind of shift their resources towards, I guess, away from that traditional newspaper pro to the person that wants to go and experience Africa for the first time or whatever. Do you think it was that part of it, or was it? Yeah.
Yes, in a way. Like the newspaper business was a big chunk. So there was newspaper and government business, which is, a very big thing, not only for Canon, but Nikon as well. So having worked for both companies in those pro teams and seeing where the priorities were, it was very different back then, because the shelf life of a pro model, like a 1 series camera, they were 5 or 6 years. So a newspaper, if you take, say, News Limited as an example, or Getty, is they all buy on CapEx. So every year money comes around, they've got to spend it. And once they've all got that latest model, unless they increased the number of staff, and there was a period probably mid-2000s where there was a mass redundancy in news because digital had made things quicker and easier, and speed and immediacy changed. And that was probably only about 3 years after that, after they'd already cut the workforce in half of full-time photographic staff, it halved again, and then video came on board. So I remember when the 5D Mark II came out, I was like, who wants a compact camera consumer feature in an SLR? And man, that took off. But it just changed the game. But I think the Canon Collective thing, the whole point of it was brand advocacy, because pros use what they use for a reason, but consumers are swayed differently on their choice of products. And it was solely, it kind of it wasn't marketing and it wasn't sales. It was something in between, in a way. And it was really to build brand advocacy. And it did work. I mean, there was some customers that turned up to early workshops that had, an old 7D and, a 100 to 300 EF, your little kit lenses and stuff. And this one customer now owns an R3, an R5, a 600 mm f4. Like, you're talking 30 grand investment in gear that up until that point, he didn't know he needed it until he used it. So the recipe of Canon Collective worked really well for that reason. But at the same token, it started out earlier on where all the workshops were free. So you'd find you just get the same people getting the tickets, and then because they're not invested, they just wouldn't turn up sometimes.
Yeah.
So we started charging for it, and, it became a revenue. But in its final sort of death throes, it was just maintaining a program. It wasn't about making profits. So they were affordable experiences. Yes. And then the bigger tours and workshops, like my Lake Air trips, the Africa tours. I mean, Greg took a trip to Croatia. Scott took a trip to Japan. There was trips to Antarctica, a whole bunch of stuff that went under the Canon Collective banner. But this was stuff that I was, obviously doing before Canon. And then I just said, how can I make this work for me without having to use manual leave? Turn it into work. And that's what I did. So
perfect.
And then when it all collapsed, I'm like, I don't want to go back to a full-time job. I want to keep doing this. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Yeah.
Doing that. It's perfect. What about this? Where was this?
So that's in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. So that was before Canon. So that was me working with, Shem, you see the guy at the back in the blue long sleeve shirt on the right-hand side. So he's the other owner of C4. So he's, the guy that owns the hides as well. So him and Andre are the two guys that run that company. And then there's a fellow in the middle with a hat on with a shadow across his face. Yeah, Dennis. So Dennis Glennon, who I'd done a lot of the early photographic tours, which changed the model and how I did them. So the first supported trip that I ran was for a wholesaler in Sydney that just sold African travel. And this was before there was really an industry for photo tours. There really was a handful of people doing it. And they weren't advertised. Travel agents didn't sell it because no one was coming into a travel agent asking for something that was still fairly new in the industry. And I was running my own tours with this company, and it was kind of the lower end of medium in budget and experience. And at that time, again, working for Canon Professional Services, I got a call from Dennis one day, who's based over in Perth, and he said, I just wanted to have a quick chat about Africa. Maybe give me a call after work. And I was like, oh, you're interested in joining me on a trip? He's like, no, I'm interested in you working on mine. So Dennis just did high end. It was private aircraft, 5-star all the way. And if you've got one competitor in the market, you're not competing with the 50 people trying to get the middle to low end market. And I kind of modeled how I work now, basically off what I learned from Dennis, who was a high-end businessman, a CEO of major corporations his whole life. So got a lot in the way that I hold myself professionally in business has definitely come from what I learned from Dennis. Yeah.
Man.
Who years going through Canon, there was a project that Dennis did with Tony Hewitt called Girt by Sea. It was done a few years ago. So they actually flew the entire coastline of Australia in about 38 days and photographed aerial photography all the way around. And that was a project that Dennis had wanted to work on with Tony. So if you don't know Tony Hewitt, look him up. He's won photographic awards through Australia end on end for landscape and aerial work. But even with world photo competitions, so WPPI, so World Photography Awards, he won first, second, and third one year in landscape.
What?
So, he was a Nikon user, and I remember at the time, Dennis said, "What do you think of this concept?" And I said, "Look, I'll have a chat to the director at the time," and they started chatting, and next minute, if you use some Canon cameras, Dennis already used Canon, but we ended up getting Tony Hewitt onto Canon gear for this project, which, he was a staunch Nikon user. He uses Phase 1 for most of his stuff now anyway, but this whole project was shot on 5D Mark IVs and 1DX Mark IIs at the time. But look up Girt by Sea.
Yeah, okay. I'll have to check it out. That sounds. I didn't even know that project existed.
Yeah.
So
it was turned into a book. So the website, I believe, still has books available and prints as well. But some stunning stuff. All abstract aerial. Yeah. And when they did the opening, Canon helped fund it and supported it. But when it went around the exhibition, it didn't have the location under the prints. So the catalogue where you could buy them had the information of where it was taken. But on the walkthrough, they had Julie Bishop open the exhibition in Sydney. And on the walkthrough that we did, and they had, a lot of special guests and dignitaries turn up on the night, they walked through and they were asked, "Where do you think this is taken?" And you'd see turquoise water and bright orange sand, and they're like, "Oh, that's got to be somewhere in the Pilbara in WA." I'm like, "No, that was in Tasmania." So on the walkthrough, they deliberately challenge you to think where you think it might be, and you were off every single time. It's just phenomenal. Yeah.
I'll have to check it out. That sounds great.
Definitely. Yeah. The book is stunning. I've got a copy on my bookshelf. It is absolutely stunning. Yeah.
To see if I can still order a copy. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Especially like doing the entire coastline. That's unreal.
And just logistics behind it, because up in the top end, they had to have fuel dumps hidden. They basically had to fly backwards and forwards and then have that fuel supply moved into strategic spots. And it was planned to the dollar. So once they got to the end, they had to account for bad weather, wind, using more fuel based on that weather. They were literally leaving early on locations to avoid storms and get ahead of things. And when it got to the end, and this is, the pedigree of where Dennis has come from and high-end business, nearly to the dollar he'd budgeted where, he didn't have to get halfway through and dig into his own pocket or go back to Canon, who was the major sponsor, asking for more money. It literally was on budget 38 days.
Wow. Planned perfectly.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Yeah. Very cool. What about this one?
So this is down in Victoria, actually, in Cape Shanks. So it's a common location. I run my long exposure workshops. So I am an ambassador with Hader Filters. So we do hand out full kits to customers. So they've got, $1,500 full ND filter kit from Hader for the duration of those workshops. So it is a cool location. Low tide, if anyone's looking this location up, you've got to know it. There's twice that I've ever been to this point because of where the swell comes in. You need a very, very flat, low calm, low tide day to even walk near that spot.
To get out there, yeah.
Yeah, there's no way. You'd be neck deep in water and being smashed to death by waves and rocks if you tried to get to that point. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I will skip through some of that. More Africa.
Yeah, that's Namibia. So that was Namibia? Towards the end of one of those trips. So that was actually off the back of a few years ago. Canon had a competition called the Canon Light Awards, and it was done in cinemas in each state, where you had 3 cinemas and 3 photographers that had a 3-hour talk. Then they'd set a brief, and you had 24 hours to submit your image. Then there was a state grand final, and then the overall grand final was the winner of each state were flown into Tasmania. They didn't know that they were going to Tassie. They were just told to meet at the airport and what to pack. and they had 2 days to shoot a folio of 5 images. And I think the brief was hit the hidden Tasmania. And then the winner won a trip to Africa with my good self. So that was, was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's unreal. It's so, so many cool things that were happening that, I mean, I guess you had to be plugged in to be hearing about it. I remember hearing about the Light Awards, but I don't remember that level of prizes and that sort of stuff. That's
yeah. And it was
amazing.
the guy fourth in from the left, Alistair McBurney. He was the lucky winner in the mint-coloured shirt. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolute character. Still a great mate. So.
Oh, that's so cool. Let's talk about Antarctica, because you went this year.
Yeah, in February.
In February. Tell me about it.
There are no words that explain it and give it justice. I can tell you that. Like, I've had, 18 years of seeing Africa, and it's not like it's seeing the same thing. It's different. Every country's different. I mean, every trip, even to the same location, I've been, Mashatu pretty much year on year since 2007, and still see different stuff every time I go. But more or less, it's the same wildlife and similar landscape. While you get really landscape differences, I found when the wildlife's not doing something and you're in an area that's scrubby bush, your jaw's not on the ground in wow all day. Whereas Antarctica, you're literally doing this every 5 minutes because you're just mind blown by what you're seeing. You're surrounded by ice and icebergs, and if there is no wildlife, the landscape alone is enough to knock you off your feet. It's phenomenal.
Well, speaking of which, this image I can't stop looking at. It's the one that we use for the thumbnail of this this video. Like, is this what it looked like? Have you edited this? Like, is this what you see when you go down there?
That's fairly much straight out of camera. That's about 11:30 at night.
Oh, wow.
So that was in their summer. So you don't get the longest days. So you generally find November, December as the longest days. It's almost 24 hours of daylight. The sun doesn't set. Whereas once you get to sort of mid to late January, it might be dark for about 3 hours. So sun would set around 11, then you'd get that sort of last bit of light around 11:30. And then around 3 to 3:30 a.m., you'd get that blue hour light for about 2 hours before sunrise, because it just skims the horizon. So it's just sitting just below the horizon, and then it pops up again. So I found on this night, we're going through the Gillard Strait. So there you've got towering cliffs on your left-hand side, or depending if you're going in or out of this particular location. But you're in there the whole night. So we had dinner on the deck outside that night, a barbecue. And everyone had finished dinner, went up to the front of the ship for a couple of drinks and whatnot. And you've just got this barrage of icebergs on the horizon that are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger as you're cruising on towards them. And one by one, it's getting colder as it's getting later. People are peeling off and going to bed. And I found myself probably the last one left for nearly 3 hours, where I couldn't walk away. I couldn't go back to my room and go to sleep, because I was like, let's just see what the next iceberg looks like. And this is like after the first couple of days. And you've just got the next one comes up. You're tired. You're getting up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock the next morning, and you just can't peel yourself away from it. It's phenomenal.
Wow. It's look, ever since I think I watched a YouTube video of someone that went on a trip to Antarctica, and ever since then I've just been sort of hooked on it. But it's such a huge investment, especially for two people to go. Like, it's a pretty serious chunk of money to get down there. And the other thing is this question in the chat is actually perfect for it. I'd love to go, but I'm damn sure I'd be seasick for 2 weeks. What's the deal with getting down there?
I have a solution for you. We fly in, we don't sail. So what options you have now is this product that we use through a company called Antarctica 21. They were the pioneers of what's known as the air cruise. So we fly from Chile. So from Punta Arenas, we fly a 2-hour flight to an island called King George Island. And from King George Island, that's the very southern tip of what is known as the Drake Passage. So anyone that's looked into going to Antarctica has heard about the dreaded Drake Passage, which is the roughest ocean in the world, right? So that's normally a 2-day sail from Ushuaia to get into the Antarctic Peninsula. We get there in 2 hours, not 2 days. And when you arrive, you're already in calm seas. So the whole time you're in the Antarctic Peninsula, it's all in sheltered coves. And the ship will, based on weather and wind and other things, will stick to locations that are protected to avoid any rough seas. So by the time you get back to King George Island, you fly back home again in 2 hours and not 2 days. So all in all, you're saving 4 days, which if you sail down, you've got 4 days at sea where you've got nothing to do but to be seasick. So seasickness, not a problem if you do it the way that I take my clients in personally.
Okay. So there's got to be some downsides or something to it. What are the negatives to flying in? Do you miss out on anything? Is it
Nothing.
double the price? Why doesn't everyone fly in?
So yes, it's more expensive, but from a 2-hour flight, you land and by day one, you're in Antarctica. Whereas normally the 2 days at sea, there's no icebergs, there's nothing to see for 2 days but open ocean and, 15 to 20 foot, 30 foot swell.
Yeah.
So you're not missing anything. And when the Drake is really rough, you can't even go outside on the balcony. You're literally sitting in your room, strapped like a seatbelt in bed, essentially, with a vomit bucket taped to your face. So, for the extra cost, people will look at the cost and say, 6 days in Antarctica. I've seen a tour that's $3,000 cheaper, and it's 12 days. It's like, okay, but
I see.
4 days of that is just getting there and back. And what happens is the advantage for us is when you arrive at King George Island, overnight you're sailing as far south into the peninsula as possible. So when you wake up the next morning, for the rest of the trip, you're slowly making your way back up in the peninsula at 2 different locations every single day.
Right.
Whereas you'll find the sail option, you're sailing all the way down. You can't go as far because you have to turn around and get back in time. So we go further south as possible because we're getting there a lot faster. So you can afford to not burn up as much time getting down in order to get back. And then the other advantage we use with this ship here, the Ocean Nova, it only takes 67 total passengers. So I'm responsible for, say, up to 10's about the minimum that I'd take. And that ensures that only 67 passengers in total. There's a law throughout Antarctica that wherever one ship is, you won't see another ship. So there could be 30 or 40 different cruises happening in and around you at any given time. But to anchor up and go on a shore landing, you can be the only ship there. So you go whole days without seeing another ship at all because the law and the rule is you can't have more than 100 people at that bit of land at any given time. So the disadvantage on, you might find a cheaper trip, but you're on a ship with 200 or 300 passengers. That means it's parked at one location for a whole day and you have to wait your turn in order to go on to a landing. So for 2 or 3 hours in the morning, while half of the ship is out on land, you're sitting listening to penguin lectures and killing time in order to wait your turn. Then you go out, you do your landing, you come back. Then overnight the ship will move. Now the difference for us is we pull up to a location with 67 total passengers. Within 20 minutes, we're in Zodiacs and we're on shore. Then when we get back, they move the ship as we're having brunch. We get to the afternoon, we're out in another landing. So we're actually getting 2 unique locations a day for 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon.
Right. And how many days total of that sort of activity?
So you've got pretty much 5 days in Antarctica, but the first and the last day is getting to and from King George Island. So you've essentially got 4 days with 2 3-hour landings a day. So you've got 8 3-hour landings in different locations every single time.
Okay.
For that cost.
And that's the primary activity of what you're going down there is for those 8 landings. And obviously the in between, the scenery that you see from the trip in between each spot is also an amazing part of the journey. Yeah. I guess that's the other benefit too, is if the ship's sort of moving each day, you're enjoying sort of a change of scenery on the ship rather than that happening while you're asleep.
Yeah. So out of the ship, like that iceberg shot you pulled up, that was taken just on the move. That was after dinner and on the ship. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you don't necessarily have to be out in a zodiac to get sort of beautiful scenery, beautiful images. You can
No.
just be, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Let me just have a look. What about this? Where was
Again,
this
that
just taken from the
was
ship?
yeah, from the ship. That was on the same night as the other iceberg, but a little bit later. But that sunset sort of light hangs around a lot longer than when we see sunset and it sort of disappears. You get 20 minutes of that color pop, and then it fades off. You get about an hour and a half of it there because the sun's just skimming along the horizon before it drops.
Yeah,
Because you're so far south. So you get that quality of light for a good chunk of your afternoon every day.
every day.
And that's why it is. And that's why I favor February personally. So it's coming to the very end of the season because by the time it comes to March, you get longer. You probably got 6 hours of night. And then after March, then, you'll go through where you only get 1 hour of daylight and it's dark for the whole of their winter.
Yep.
So why I favor February is you get more melt, which means there's more exposed land, which means there's more penguins that have nested and their chicks have reared by that time. Whereas if you go in, say, December, there's more pack ice around, but that's when the penguins are just starting to breed. So they haven't got the nests yet. So a lot of the time, they're still out in the water feeding, so you don't get them up on the ice and on the land. So when you do your landings, you don't have the mass numbers of penguins around. Right. Whereas February, the chicks have all reared and they're all starting to fledge. And if you're lucky, there are some locations, so the further north you are on the peninsula, they fledge a little bit earlier. And if you're lucky, I mean, not lucky for them, but you see predation going on with the leopard seals chasing, penguins that have entered the water for the first time, and you realize that Happy Feet isn't all fun. So
yeah, there's still the natural order of things.
Yeah.
Real
but
life.
that's everything. So all the other predators, the orcas as well. We had orcas on a couple of sightings. Every species of whale are there at that time because that's when all of the food's in the water. So I really favored February. If you're there for wildlife and you're still going to get killer landscape, killer light and icebergs, then I find February very hard to beat. Whereas you probably find people that were there just for landscape and icebergs, you'd probably go in December if that was a secondary interest. But if you want a best of both, then I'd definitely say February. Yeah.
February. Is this another one of those things where you need that 600mm lens if you want to be able to get up close to wildlife?
Not at all. That was just 100 to 400. So it was probably only. I mean, you get right up to the side of these things. They're not that worried by you. They've got no predator except for orcas. Yeah. So anything walking on land or floating around on the surface of the water, they couldn't care less about you. They're not nervous at all. No.
Just looks so funny. Such a looks like a comedy animal. Like just.
Well, that's the thing. They kind of look cute and endearing until they open their mouth. They've got these big yellow, big mouthful of razor sharp teeth. So yeah, they're the only sort of intimidating looking seal. The others all look cute, whereas leopard seals they mean business. They're killers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, orcas. This is just and then you see this image and you're like, all right, I gotta go. I have to go.
Yeah. And I was just, I went for the wildlife and fell in love with the icebergs. It's probably one way to put it. As much as the wildlife had the impact I expected and beyond expectations, if I'm honest, I didn't expect to be so overwhelmed by icebergs. I was addicted, hooked. As I said, I was standing there probably minus 10 degrees. I had the option of going to bed and I couldn't walk away from the view. I just had to shoot the next iceberg just in case it was a good one. It was addictive. Yeah.
Did you come back? Were you sleep deprived when you got back?
Pretty much. I mean, Africa's the same. You get back from a trip and you need a holiday. So
yeah, it's crazy.
So that last shot you saw there is actually in a place called Deception Island, which funnily enough, it's an old whaling station. So those were the old boilers that they used to boil all the whale blubber and get all the whale oil. Because back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even up to the 60s, whale oil and whatnot was used in a lot of cosmetics and things. And through like the 50s and whatnot, it was used in London, New York, in all of the street lights and the lanterns. They were all lit by using whale oil. And then over years, I mean, electricity changed that, and then consumer sentiment for whales changed, and the whole whale oil industry died as a result. But this station here was just abandoned and left, and that is actually in the mouth of an undersea volcano. So you'll see it's all black sand.
Mm.
So when you turn up to this location, there was the ship shot that you saw earlier with that cliff edge. That is actually the rim of a volcano. So in the ship, you actually sail between these two headlands into this big moon-shaped bay, and that is literally a volcano crater. So you turn up on this beach and there's steam pouring out of the sand. It's because it's heat. You dig your hand into the sand and it's hot.
Really? So it's an active volcano.
Active volcano, yeah. I think the last time it went off was in the 60s, possibly. And there was an airstrip built in there, but it's got a dogleg in it. So the planes used to have to land and then turn to get around because there was nowhere long enough because the beach is round. But all of the remnants are still there. There's huge, big whale oil tankers, big drums at the side. And it's just, it's like this apocalyptic scene of just a trashed society with wildlife wandering around inside. And we're the only ones there. You wander around in this location and there is nothing for days.
Does it truly kind of feel like you're doing something actually out of the ordinary? A really new experience that you can't just Google what it's like or whatever. You really have to be there.
Well, just the scale of it is different, because you can see wildlife images of something sitting next to a tree, and you've seen a tree before, but you've never seen an iceberg. So it's hard to really quantify exactly what the experience is like until you've seen it. Yeah. It's very, very hard to put into words. And I even looked at images and video footage that I'd taken of the actual trip. And while it brings back memories, I sit and remember what it looked like in my head, not by looking at my images, because it's different. It's the only way I can describe it is that the experience in real life versus the pictures, it just evokes your memory to what it actually looked like. And it's just phenomenal. It really is.
Trip of a lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it'll be one of many, but I've got some tickets available for next year's trip, still available. So
anyone that's again in February?
Same time, 6th to the 13th of February next year.
6th to the 13th. And tell me, let's talk gear again. Here you are with the 100 to 400, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
What's required for an Antarctica trip to make the most of it if you're going on a photography tour?
Yep. So if you look, a lot of the time you're wearing gloves. So I use the Valorette gloves, which I know that you've got some involvement with here in Australia as well.
We do. We've got more stock on the way. We've been out for a little while, but it's coming.
Yep, fantastic. So I find changing lenses and things when it's cold and you've got gloves, and as much as they are dexterous when you put your fingertips through the ends, you don't really want to be changing lenses, especially in the Zodiac. It just takes one spray of one little lump in the water, and before you know it, salt water's in your camera. So I found the 24 to 105 or the 15 to 35 on one body, particularly if you're in the Zodiacs next to towering icebergs. I just had the 15 to 35 on one and the 100 to 400 on the second camera. I'd go as far to say that the 24 to 105, I probably used it for half an hour out of the whole trip. The whole trip otherwise was 100 to 400 on the R3 and 15 to 35 on the R5. You didn't need much more.
Do you need every bit of that 100 to 400 focal length? Or
No.
could you get away with it with, say, a 70 to 200, 2.8 on an R5 body and just crop in a little bit?
Yeah, you could. I mean, sometimes like with whales or something like that are further off, then every bit of reach helps. But on land, the penguins are right next to you. I mean, you can literally sit down. You can't sit on the ground at the time we were there because there was some bird influenza that could affect colonies. So before you get on and off the ship, like you're loaned the boots, essentially. I've actually got a pair here, these. I went out and bought a pair this week because they're so bloody good. And they're completely waterproof. You can stand up to your knees in the water and water won't get through, and they'll keep your feet warm down to minus 40.
Okay.
But when you get back on the ship, there's two big troughs full of Dettol and scrubbing brush sort of things. You sit there and scrub your boots before you go back on. So when you get to the next location, you're not spreading any parasites or diseases that might be in a colony. So
Yep.
with that said, normally you could sit on the ground because it's so cold, it's dry.
Yep.
So people get worried about, oh, what happens if my gear gets covered in snow? It's so cold, it doesn't melt. So it's actually dry. It just falls off like powder.
Okay.
So in that regard, because of the outbreak of some of the possible diseases with birds, you weren't allowed to kneel or you weren't allowed to sit. You could squat down. You just couldn't have your knees, hands, or your backside touching snow.
Okay.
So with that, the flip out screen, you just bend down and get ground down shots. And, you had baby penguins walking all the way up, almost pecking at your lens.
Yeah.
So you don't need super long lenses, because I was wanting to take my 600 mil. And there was an onboard photographer that works for the cruise company that they go out on all of the activities and landings and they photograph the guests. And then there's a big slideshow on the final night with, an open bar.
Yeah.
And then you get a copy of all of those images, because, you're on this trip of a lifetime. Some people will just be carrying a selfie stick or a 360 cam filming their whole experience. But what the nice touch is, by the end, you get a login and you can download all the photos. So, your friends are like, oh, show me a photo of you in Antarctica. That's all handled for you. And I'll do that for my guests as a nice bonus surprise at the end. It's, here's a bunch of photos that I took. You didn't know they were taken, but here you go, enjoy them. But, you don't need a lot of big gear for the sheer fact that the wildlife's not scared of you and you're walking amongst them. Yeah.
Okay. So you would say a reasonably sort of versatile long lens, and like we've said, probably 2 camera bodies just in case you drop one in the water off the side of the ship or something. You don't want your photography trip to be over. And then a wide lens of some sort, and you're done.
And you've got like stunning quality of light all day, so you don't have to worry. There's no shadows, there's no trees, there's no shade to worry about. So, in saying that, you don't need 2.8 lenses, is what I'm getting at. So, the 100 to 400 barely got over 2 or even 400 ISO most of the time, because part of me, if you've had a lot of experience shooting in the snow, I know you've done a lot of stuff with snowboarding and whatnot. Everything's reflecting. You're not worrying about fill. It's all perfect. So, unless you get those blue sky days and you do get some harsh contrast, but
even then it's pretty good with the fill off snow. Usually, like, it's still pretty easy. Like, you don't need insane dynamic range like you do if you're trying to do the same thing. I shoot in forests for mountain biking and stuff, and if it's like harsh dappled light coming through trees, but there's nothing reflecting it, it's brutal. So that's good to know.
It's the type of thing that, anything you point your lens at looks like a postcard shot. It looks like the photos you saw in the brochure that made you want to go, and there's nothing to do to them. And we had a lot of overcast skies on our particular trip, which in February, you will get a bit more dramatic weather starting. The wind starts to pick up and other things, whereas you find through December, it's just big blue skies every day. So I would prefer clouds and drama any day over blue skies, because you won't get stuff like this. So again, that's why I favor February over December.
To get this kind of look. Look at that iceberg.
Yeah, these big ethereal looking things. I just absolutely hooked. After the first sighting of an iceberg, I was just nuts for them.
I love it. It's definitely on the list. I don't know if I can make it by February. It is like I said, it's a big investment, especially once you look into the, flying, just flying across before you actually board the plane to go on your tour. All of that adds up. So it's something you really need to be prepared for financially, but it's good to know that you don't need to invest in giant lenses to make the most of it, as long as you got sort of decent gear. This one popped up. So you're saying you don't, like weather sealing on your bodies and lenses, how critical is it for Antarctica?
So not critical really, for the fact that it doesn't rain. If it rains, it turns into snow, so you don't get rain as such. So sleet and any moisture that will build up in your camera is not a problem. When you're in the zodiacs, if it's windy or you're going into chop, then you might get splashes over the front of the boat. So if you're going to shore landings, then I just take a dry bag. So I got a big roll top dry bag. I actually got it from Adreno, the outdoor dive shops, Adreno, I think they're called. And I could fit my whole camera backpack into it. and it's a roll top that's completely waterproof. So the reason I do that is when you get on and off the ship, there's just a little pontoon and a big open door off the side of the ship. So if it was rough or you slipped and you dropped a bag or you fell off the Zodiac for any given reason, it floats and your gear's rescued. So what I find is when you're doing photography from the Zodiacs, it's when you're on a calm day and you're not going to get the splashes and things. So if it's choppy, just put your gear in a dry bag. So you might get to a point where you don't even take a camera bag on a shore landing. You just have 2 cameras with a camera strap, throw them in the dry bag, and when you get on land, you can leave the dry bag at the shore with the Zodiacs. You walk around for 3 hours with, spare batteries and things in your pockets, or, a spare lens in your pocket, and not worry about a bag. So that's one way to do it. But you certainly don't need housings or waterproof jackets and stuff on your lenses. And the good thing is each landing is 3 hours and you decide what you want to do. So the guides will get on land, 20 or 30 minutes before we go on land, and they'll mark off 3 different walks with some neon flags. So they'll stick them in and you can either go up the mountain that side, along the beach that side, or up the mountain that side. So in that 3 hours, you can get to all locations comfortably and walk around and do whatever you want. If you're not overly fit or don't want to tackle the climb, you can just stay on the shoreline surrounded by penguins. You might get on for the first hour and then think, I want to go and do a Zodiac cruise and get close to some icebergs and find some leopard seals on icebergs. Then you just go to the shore and all of the Zodiacs are on shore. And if you're the only one there that wants to go, the driver will go, no problem, jump in, let's go. And again, that's the beauty of the program we run. It's like choose your own adventure. You do what you want when you want.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Sounds very cool. And then would you, in terms of being part of a photography-oriented group on the tour, so there's 60-something people on the ship, but there's a small group with you that are part of your tour. Do you guys interact, outside of these landings to have a look at photos and talk about that kind of stuff? How does that work?
Yeah, look, we have, so in between landings on the ship, I mean, it's a visual assault all day. And because it doesn't get dark till late, if you draw your blinds, you've got blackout blinds in your rooms because every room's got a portal to see outside. But I found I couldn't draw it closed because I felt like I was missing something. So I'm falling asleep with full light pumping through, and then it's full light again by about 4 o'clock in the morning. And I'd find myself just drifting off to sleep, and I'd be like, oh, I wonder what's happening outside. And you'd turn around, look out the porthole, and go back to sleep again. So you were kind of, always, you couldn't drag yourself away from what was going on. But sorry, what was the question? I've gone probably off topic.
I'll come back to it, but before you get to that, so you're saying, when was the first time you went to Antarctica?
This year. So I'd actually I'd had 4 opportunities to go in the past that clashed with other things. So for any reason, it just didn't happen for me. So yeah.
And you're telling me that you've been to Africa for 16 years, was it?
18 years this year, yeah.
18 years, you photographed in tons of other countries, worked for Canon, worked for Nikon, and you went to Antarctica this year and you were still getting like FOMO through the night that you might be missing out on a beautiful photo.
Yeah, and I think that partly might be because it was a new experience, but in all honesty, I could go 100 days straight and I'd still be doing it every day because, again, it was the icebergs that were getting me. It was like I just had in my head I wanted this collection of solo icebergs with no other clutter, just an iceberg and doomy skies, and I could just see them as a collection or a print series. So it came to me very early in the trip that was a priority for me as a collection of images that I wanted to start to capture.
Yeah, I can if a location can inspire someone that's seen so many things already and done so many things, then it's obviously got something special about it.
Yeah, well, to me, I find it's important to anchor yourself into having a project or a long-term project in hand. And Africa, I've got a long-term project that I shoot. But being a first trip to Antarctica, I was like, okay, this is trip 1. I want to try and anchor into something that every trip I can add to a collection. So with Africa, it didn't start for me until 2010, taking portraits of male lions that are compositionally identical. And
I'm gonna bring them up.
Bring
I'm
some
gonna
up for sure.
bring them up on the screen. These are the other thing that when you sent these photos through, it actually wasn't until I opened them up full screen. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this stream will do them justice, but
Sure.
it's like they're staring straight through me.
So this only works with male lions because you'll see with the mane, it fills in the blank areas. Whereas a female lion or a leopard or a different species of cat without a mane, you're going to get background.
Yes.
So this one is just the same composition, direct eye contact and symmetrical. And I've got thousands of lions that I've photographed that don't meet the collection because their heads are on an angle, their eyes aren't straight to camera. The focal length was different, so the compression looks different. These are all shot very same distance with the same composition. So the plan for me in the end is that whether this be an exhibition or a book, imagine these printed A1 or AO and standing in a room and turning around and just having direct eye contact with lions. So it's only the character that changes. Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be a beautiful exhibition.
Yeah.
How will you know when it's done?
I didn't know for years. When I see the last one, I'll kind of have a feeling, but in my head, I want to try and get to 100.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
I thought you might say 30 or something or 20. No, 100.
Well, I just think once you get to those sort of numbers, it just gives you, it'd be like trying to take 30 portraits of different looking people. It doesn't cover enough variety. Whereas you'll have some lions that look quite similar and you get others that, there's one in here, when you get there, you'll know the one. He had a buffalo horn through his face 2 days before we got there. And that was the first one in the series. So in 2010...
This one's like, it's like he's sad.
Yeah. He's seen some stuff, but
yeah,
in saying that, he hasn't had a lot of action because he's still got quite a clean face. And you'll generally find by the time lions develop a full mane, they're already at the age that they're competing for territory and they're probably being kicked out of their own pride by their own father. So by then, they've already copped some battle scars. Yeah. So this guy was part of a bigger pride. And if your pride's big, you're really not going to get messed with by an outsider. Whereas you'll find lions that have just brutally torn to pieces, they're generally the only dominant male, and they might have had a coalition of males. And there was a period of about 10 years in an area in Botswana where they had a pride of lions that killed probably 100 lions by overthrowing prides. And there was this coalition of, it was these 5 males, these 5 brothers that just decimated lion populations, because what happens is when they overthrow a pride, they kill all of the cubs to sire their own. So not only were they either chasing off or killing the dominant males, and what will happen is the cubs will get wiped out as well. So some of the females, if they get away with their cubs, they go. But straight away, the females then go into estrus and mate with them because they're a stronger competitor. So, these things have come in and killed their cubs, yet straight away they're like, all right, okay, well, let's have some kids of our own. So it's... if you believe in reincarnation, you don't want to come back as a lion. It's not a good life.
Sounds rough.
But he was the first in the series. So I edited that particular picture and I just sort of looked at it, and this was in 2010. And I thought, I'm going to try and get another one of these on the trip. And I managed a second one on that same trip. But, I've been on trips where I've got none. So it's not an easy thing to get. High frame rate plays a hand in it, but again, it just takes that slightest difference in angle where the head's not completely symmetrical for it to not work.
I can imagine. Yeah, it's like you can't just wave a stake at them or something to get them to look at the camera. It's or is it just luck? Like how do you you're just ready looking for it, and hopefully they look at you.
Yep, and it depends on the situation. Most of the time these things are flat out asleep with droopy eyes because they're just sitting there panting in the heat. So it takes, conditions, it takes, at what phase these things probably sleep for 22 hours of a day. So you've just got to be there in good light at the right time when they're actually awake and active. And yeah, it's just luck.
This first shot was with a 600mm?
No, so that was the 500 f4 with that one. So all of them, up until I only got my 600mm in 2021. So I've used my 500 f4 on every trip up until then. So everyone in the collection except for the last 5 that I got were on a 500 f4, and now it's with a 600.
Yeah, and 2010. So this would have been like what camera?
That would have been
1DX.
no, it was before the 1DX. So that would have
Oh,
been,
was it?
I reckon, it's either the 1D Mark III or the 1D Mark IV. Be one or the other. Yeah.
Isn't it fun to look back through images like this? And I'm only looking at I'm looking at it on my laptop screen at the moment, which is it's a Retina screen. Looks beautiful, super sharp, just great. But it's a 14-year-old camera.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't be out. I couldn't shoot with that now. It wouldn't do the job.
Oh, they do though. They hold up just fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a 1D Mark IV sitting on the shelf there.
Yeah.
Which I play around with every now and then. But yeah, it's nice to look back through images sometimes and see a great image and go, yeah, I don't need a new camera.
Yeah. Even better. I mean, I use proper calibrated high-end professional monitors, but the thing to keep in mind as well is you're still viewing something at 72 DPI when you're looking at it on any monitor. Whereas I've got these printed up to about A1, and the eyes, the texture in the fur, it feels like you could touch the print and feel it.
Yeah.
And that's off, a 16 megapixel camera that, yes, it's probably been cropped slightly. So you're probably still only looking at maybe a 12 megapixel file. But again, once you're up at 300 DPI in a print, all these people that are carrying on, I use 50 megapixel cameras because I can crop. I'm like, I've got an image off an 8 megapixel camera that's been cropped. So there's probably only 5 megapixel left in the file. Printed at, A2, and it still looks fine.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is coming, more to my point. This lion's had a lot more fight over territory, and that sort of, those scars and things can happen just on a feeding incident. So the females will pull down, prey. He'll come in and get first dibs on it. You might have 5 females all swiping at his face, but he'll still drag the carcass away and get first dibs, but he'll come out with scars as a result.
Yeah, right. So it may not even be a fight, a competition. It might just be just day-to-day life.
Yeah. I mean, cubs have been killed. Their own cubs have been killed in the lineup for food. And that's just been, they've swatted at another full-grown lion over food to get out of the way. And a cub's there and had its back broken as a result. But, they've got that much power, a full-blown, even if it weren't for the claws, a full-blown, full-speed hit of that paw, which is the size of a dinner plate, that connects with you, that'll break your neck. You'll die from the impact alone. So, yeah.
Scary.
Then there's some like this in the collection, which is slightly different light. I mean, it was side lit, so... technically I might say it doesn't fit with the rest of them. It's close, but it's not perfect. I mean, I know I could edit this now with Lightroom and just bring a grad in from the left-hand side and fix that. But, in the end, when I look at a final collection, I'll probably have a grade that I'll run over everything just so there is some repetition as such as far as mood and tone, but it's just the character that will change. Yeah.
Yeah. A few great comments coming in here from Grant. Grant's one of the hosts, the co-hosts we have on like a weekly live show where we just talk about photography and stuff. And he's commenting because on the weekend I did go into a Leica store and I did happen to fall in love with a Leica Q2. So says me, I want a Leica. Yeah, I understand. I'm full of contradictions, Grant.
We'd all like a Leica. I mean, I know a very close friend of mine who was up until a few years ago one of the Canon masters, Crystal Wright. Crystal's an ambassador now and endorsed with Leica. So yeah,
and I'm sure doing great things with them. So
always.
So sorry, Grant. I am going to get one day. Grant also says his wife Eilish gets angry when he tries to grab her food. So it's not just lions that have to go through this sort of stuff.
Well, it's when just as long as she doesn't slice your face open with the steak knife, and that's what these guys are dealing with, a fistful of steak knives to the face. So,
yeah.
So this is the father of the one that copped the horn through the face. So when you get to him, you'll know.
You'll know. I think that might be the next one, maybe. Yeah. Insane.
So it's what we think's happened. It's either gored straight through the front, or it's gone through the mouth and up the front of the face. But I've seen photos of him. So this was November last year. that it happened. And I saw some photos of him only about a month ago, and it's completely healed over. And
Is it really?
Normally the scar tissue, you just get black, shiny skin, but the fur's grown back over as well. So you can hardly tell that he's got it. Yeah.
Yeah, that wound is crazy. But
But
then
you
still,
could see, as he was breathing, you could see like flaps of skin moving in and out, pus rolling out of it. It was completely open. His whole nasal cavity was literally air blowing in and out of it. So,
man,
yeah, pretty full on.
that's-
And as
that
soon
is
as I
full
saw
on.
him, it was just sit there. He has to be in this collection. I got to get it. I've got to get it. There's literally only 2 frames that suit out of hundreds.
Really? How long did you
Yeah.
have to wait to get that shot?
We're on the side and we were running out of light as well. We're probably sitting there for an hour, and he kept sort of putting his head up just halfway. He was lying down and panting. He was, clearly in some pain and trying to heal. And then we thought, we're losing light. And then they got up and started walking. So they were actually about 200 meters away from an elephant carcass. So there had been an elephant that had died of natural causes. And they'd been protecting that carcass for about 4 or 5 days, and it reeked. It was absolutely horrific. And there were hyenas everywhere. So these guys, every couple of hours, would get up and walk in and have a feed and chase all the hyenas off. But even though they were a good distance away from it, the hyenas didn't dare come near it. And then I remember the day they got off and just left the carcass. All these vultures, all of these hyenas just came in and polished it off. There was nothing left of it after that. But there wasn't much left on it anyway. But, they guarded it for about 4 days. So we knew that they were going to be in that area for every day.
Yeah.
But when they're that full of food, they're not going to be active. And that was part of the problem. They're not going to put up their head if they're lying digesting food in the heat. So it was just lucky that afternoon. It was cooling down. It was losing light. And they were up after 2 days of gorging that there was time for them to eat again. So it was just circumstances. But again, it was knowing behavior and knowing when to target it and come up with the goods. Yeah.
Man, so cool. So cool. Such a great series already. Oh, yeah, I love that one. Yeah, such a great series. I can't wait to see how it develops.
No, it's going to take some time to get the numbers up there, particularly, it's changed for me now. When I was running the tours for Canon, I obviously was only doing 1 a year because that's all I could do because, I couldn't govern where I went. The boss had a say in that. But now it's, as long as people are booking trips, then I'll be running more of them a year. So that number will change. But I'll always go in early and leave late on tours just so I've got some days of shooting where, my customers' needs are first and foremost when I'm taking clients, whereas, I'll always have some days without customers where I can really just be hell-bent on shooting my own work.
Hey, what's more expensive, a tour to Africa or a tour to Antarctica?
Depends where you go. Like Antarctica is pretty much set price across the board because they're all competing on the same experience. The difference in the experience for Antarctica comes down to the ship you're on.
Yep.
So there's one like the Eclipse, which is probably one of the most expensive ships. You'll probably be paying 30 or 40,000 US per person. But you've got a day spa, a gym, a helicopter, an underwater submarine, and it's the absolute pinnacle of
an underwater
experience.
Submarine.
Yeah, yeah, and
in Antarctica.
Yeah. I mean, that is like for the mega rich elite can afford that, but for the average person, if you looked at, pardon me, Antarctica 21, which is the company we work with, they've got 2 ships. They've got the Magdalene Explorer and the Ocean Nova. So the Ocean Nova is a smaller ship, which is an advantage because it gets into sheltered bays where the bigger ships can't get to, which means your Zodiac trip between the ship and shore is closer. So if it is a choppy day, you don't have as much time to get soaked or whatnot before you hit land. And you can get into areas that the bigger ships can't get to. So it's actually an advantage to be on a smaller ship. So, the bigger ships are more stable, but if you're flying in and you're not doing the Drake Passage, then there's really no advantage to it otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Whereas, so Africa, like the two, like how many trips a year? Are you just running 1 trip a year to Africa? Or
look, some trips. So this year I've got 4 back-to-back trips in November alone. Yeah. So,
right. And are they all the same format? Those back-to-back trips, or are they different itineraries for different experiences?
So it's actually 2 different trips into the Okavango Delta with different itineraries. So it's the same length, and then there's a pre-trip on the first one, which is an extension. So everyone that's booked had the option of booking an extra 4-night extension to a different location.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically fly in. There'll be 4 nights at Mashatu Euphorbia, their new high-end lodge at this location here.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, fly into the Okavango Delta for 10 nights. So it'll be 3 nights at one lodge, 4 nights at one lodge, and then 3 nights at another, and then fly back. Then trip 2, I'll already be in the Delta, so the new guests will arrive. We'll do 10 nights at 3 different camps to the first itinerary. So I'll be, 20 days in the Okavango between 6 different lodges. And then that trip will end with an extension to a different location for another 4 nights at the end as well.
Right. And so ballpark, a trip like that with an extension, how much is that costing someone roughly?
Look, the Okavango, as earlier we were talking, is probably the most exclusive, expensive place that you can spend some money on in Africa. So you're looking at around, it's about 19,000.
Okay. So it's still it's more expensive than Antarctica, but not by a long shot.
Much.
No. So you're talking similar premium experiences.
Yeah. Well, similar in price, because the prices you're seeing for Antarctica, you've got to keep in mind, are in US dollars.
Yes, correct. Exactly. Actually, that's a good point.
So by the time you convert it, then, it's roughly the same. But if you weren't looking at high end, I mean, I'd probably average for, say, a 10-day trip to Mashatu and then into, say, the Sabi Sands or the Timbavati in South Africa. If you did a 5 and 4 night trip, then you'd probably look at, on average, about $9,500, give or take, would be the average for a very good trip. Yeah.
For a good trip. And then all you've got to look at is your flights in and out, and just sort of general, getting around and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, between the two, if you had to decide, very different experiences, but on cost alone, Africa would probably come in a little bit cheaper for the fact that return flights to Johannesburg are usually around $1,600, and it's one flight. You're there, and then it's either road transfer or a chartered flight into the location. Whereas to get to Antarctica, I mean, it's a flight from, say, Sydney to Santiago to Punta Arenas. So you're probably up, even economy, you're probably up around $3,500 in comparison to $1,600 return for South Africa. So flights alone and getting there is what will add to the cost. But once you're there, there is no other costs involved. All of your food, drinks, activities, everything's included.
Yeah.
And, people often balk at the price of photographic tours for wildlife. But if you think about going to, say, Europe for 2 weeks, by the time you paid entry to museums and you stood in line for an hour, by the time you paid for dinners every night, lunches every night, you're probably spending $500 or $600 a day on accommodation in Europe or the US.
Yeah.
And then by the time you put in spending money and you're easily spending, if you're on a really tight budget, probably $500 a day anyway. Whereas you look at safari, you're getting 2, 3 or 4 hour game drives a day, plus all your meals, and a lot of them do include your drinks as well. But even if you're paying for alcoholic drinks, it's cheap as. I mean, I've been on trips where you've been away for 2 weeks and the bar tab at the end's $50.
Right. So it's not like they're like, oh, they're here for a safari. Let's make the beers $15. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, it's not Fiji. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's very interesting. It's as I meant, like, they're massive investments, especially if you're taking more than one person, and they are a trip of a lifetime kind of things. But we spend so much money on gear. It's like, how long can you put this stuff off, and when do you have to sort of make it a priority if it can be? Unfortunately, Antarctica for me isn't a possibility yet, but
it's tax deductible for you.
Yes, yeah, but you got to have the money to pay to be able to claim it on tax. But it's a dream, and you got to sort of try and make these things happen, because looking at other people's photos gets me excited, but it doesn't stop me from wanting to go there. It makes me more excited to go there.
You hit the nail on the head. It started as a dream for me, and now I do it for work. So, it's not impossible. But in saying that, there are a lot of people entering the market that are doing it for the wrong reason. They're doing it because they want to go. not because they want to give clients an experience of a lifetime. So,
Yeah.
those people won't last long in the industry, but, people come and go, but you'll definitely see the guys and girls out there that do it well are still in the industry for a reason. It's literally comes down to not only choosing the right locations at the right time, but it's ensuring that when you get your customers there, that you're looking after them and ensuring that they're the priority.
Yeah. Exactly. For people like me that maybe it's not a possibility it's not a possibility next year to go to Antarctica, but hopefully it is in the future. But in the meantime, what options do you guys have for more local stuff that's in a more budget friendly price range?
So all our trips through Kakadu, you'll see some of the website, this thephotographyworkshopco.com. We've got Australian local tours as well as international. So I leave in June for our trip up through Kakadu. And that one, it spans across landscape, cultural sites and experiences as well as wildlife. So we've got privately chartered cruises. And I don't know if you've ever been into Kakadu to Yellow Waters before.
Yellow Waters doesn't ring a bell. I have been to Kakadu.
Yeah. So Yellow Waters is a place in Corinda. So you know where the Crocodile Hotel is?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you go on the cruise around. Yep. It's like a big floating pontoon with 50 people sitting in seats that you can't get up and move on.
Yep.
Yeah. That's the, if you pay as a tourist to turn up there, that's the experience, because it's all governed by the lodge. Private boats can't go on the waterways there. So the only way you're going to do a cruise there is that way. Mm-hmm. We have a maximum of 14 customers on our trips, and we charter that whole boat for our group only.
Right. Okay.
So, we pay for every empty seat in order to have 14 customers with an extra hour. So we're out on the water for 3 hours, and we stop and start and go where we want. And it's not just, the tourist cruise is the guy has the microphone on. He talks to you about the history. And, while our guide can still give us that information, our priority is we're all on here for pictures. So, there's that. And then there's other billabongs that we've got private boats that we take out and get the access that way. So the difference in what we provide is very different to just blowing up to Darwin, getting out to Kakadu and jumping on a tour. It's highly prioritized to ensure that we're getting the best access and the best ability to shoot without any other customers. But not only that, we actually stay in some private Aboriginal-owned camps. So these accommodations, there's a place where there's a big escarpment that at sunset, you've got 200 or 300 people clamber up to the top of it and sit there for sunset. Looking out from that view, it's a place called Ubia. Looking out at that view is where we're actually staying. So all the people on the hill looking, we're actually out there with no one else. We actually stay in these private areas. So there's no other tourists for the 3 nights that we're in there. And that is, we've got our own billabongs, our own vehicles out there, all the landscape stuff, all the astro stuff.
I was going to say,
Aboriginal,
dark skies, big wide open horizons, astrophotography would be a dream.
Yep. And there's some of the traditional rock art sites that is on private land that tourists can't go to, that we've got permission from the elders that are allowing us to stay on the property. They've got absolute full blessings for us to go into these areas and photograph some stuff that not everyone gets to see. Yeah.
Yeah. And is that just relationships from years of doing this kind of stuff? Like how do you build those experiences and get that access?
For me, it's partnerships. So relationships with suppliers. So I actually work with Luke and Sarah from NT Bird Specialists. So they've actually won multiple awards as Tour Operator of the Year up there. And he's highly respected, Luke, as a guide. He's worked in the industry since, driving buses for AAT King in the NT for probably the last 20 plus years. And his wife, Sarah, works for Parks NT as well. So she already has a lot of working relationships with elders and whatnot. So it's not, her relationship with the elders is formed separate to that. So there's no conflict of interest as far as there's no special access given. It's just the fact that she does things the right way and by the book, which gets mutual respect from elders as well. Whereas you'll find there is a lot of tour operators that are just me, my customers, I want. And you're not going to bend the rules. If you've been told no, you've been told no. So
Yeah.
as soon as there's that level of respect that's gone and it's clear that you're not in there for that reason, the doors start to close very, very quickly on getting access to some of this stuff. So for me, it's always partnering with the right suppliers that hold those relationships. And that's basically the reason why we get what we get.
Yeah, nice. So working with people that do things the right way.
Yeah, and it's the same as I developed. So Lake Air is the other thing that I specialize in over the last 8 years, is aerial photographic trips to Lake Air. So we're actually hanging out of open door aircraft, taking pictures of landscapes. And that one I started speaking with the owner of William Creek Hotel, which is the closest area to Lake Air physically, who also owns an aviation company. And we charter these aircraft and take customers up for 2-hour flights at a time with the door open, taking pictures of landscapes. So, there's still to date myself and 2 others. We actually took Chrissy Goldrick, who's the editor-in-chief from Australia Geographic, out there a couple of years ago for a trip, and there was an article that we had done on Lake Air and also the Painted Hills out there. And we stayed out overnight in the hills here, and we are still the only 3 people, me, an old colleague, and Chrissy, that have stayed out there overnight. I've never been as cold in my life. I was colder out there than I was in Antarctica because I wasn't wearing the right clothes.
Were you camping, or like what did you have?
I had a yoga mat and a sleeping bag. So we just chucked it all in the back of the plane, and it was just an idea. And to date, no one else has done it. There is a product that we're working on, to have swags and a bunch of stuff out there as a product in years to come. But there is, still to date, there's no one else with Astro shots out at this location. And it looks like, Mars, or the closest thing I could probably compare it to would be maybe Utah. So you've got those big sort of the pinnacles of rock and whatnot out there. But and when we take our groups out there, we can walk around. I've done so many trips out there as the owner of the property and whatnot. You can't get out there as a tourist on your own. You can't drive out there. You can only be flown into the airstrip and flown back out. It's actually on a cattle station, Anna Creek Station, which is the largest cattle station in the world. But with that land and the permission that we have, tourists can take a 45-minute walk out there. So it's about a 25-minute flight to get out there from William Creek Hotel, and then 25 minutes back. So you're essentially paying for an hour's airtime. So you're probably $600 or $700 to go for a 45-minute walk out there. But there's no other way you're going to get in there. And they have to stick to a path that the pilot takes them on. Whereas we go out there for 4 hours, we climb to the top of hills, we go wherever the hell we want. So,
and that's again because there's a relationship there, and they know that you guys aren't going to do the wrong thing, essentially.
Correct. And we pioneered it. I mean, I literally had that product for nearly 2 years before I had a competitor in the market, and I think there's probably 4 fairly well-known competitors offering similar trips now at varying price points. But I'll still put hand on heart to say that we did it first. So.
I mean, it's stunning. The landscapes are just...
So that spot there, from where the airstrip is about an hour and a half on foot to get out there. And I did it in the dark. I literally looked at my swag, took a screen copy of my compass on my iPhone. I turned around, I looked at the pinnacle and took a screen copy of my compass. And then every 10 minutes or so, as I was walking in the pitch dark, I was just turning it on to make sure I was still walking in the right direction. And we got out there and back without getting lost. But if you get lost out there, the airstrip's not lit. If you had an injury out there overnight, there's no help until the next morning when the plane's coming to pick you up again.
Oh, man.
So that's why we don't have a product out there with customers yet, but we're working on plans,
And this is what it's like in the plane?
Correct. So that door can open and close in the air if you want to. So getting out to the lake, it's only about 20 minutes from William Creek. Then we spend 2 hours flying over it before coming back. So quite often we'll just shut the door and you get faster airspeed to get out there, and then open the door, because the windows, as much as people in aviation companies say, they're special glass so you can shoot through them, you get distortion. It softens your images and it pulls all the contrast out of your files. So the difference is night and day with it open. Yeah,
and you get reflections too, depending on the angle you're shooting through, and all sorts of pain. Yeah, I've shot doors off on a chopper before, but never in a plane.
Yeah.
I can imagine you get some serious wind depending on the airspeed.
Well, not really. I mean, the wind itself, there's a little scoop which is on the side of the door frame. So you literally have to stick your head out before you feel any resistance. So like
Okay.
if your lens just creeps out a little bit, then you feel the drag, you feel it sort of drag back. But
Yeah.
the good thing is the door position where you see the lady holding the door open with the foot, we actually put a ratchet strap and just leave the door open the whole flight now.
Yep.
But you'll generally find from that position, you'd have to sort of lean forward through a comfortable range on your seatbelt to get outside. Whereas the secondary position on the inside, then you just sit sideways in the chair. And once you lean forward, you can get your lens to the edge. So it's uninterrupted. The size of the door, they call it an air van, a Gippsland air van. So it is a very wide door. So I generally find the tail seat, you get a bit of an advantage because you can see what's coming up ahead versus the indoors. So the way we do it is we just rotate the customers through. So in the morning flight, those two will go up in the same plane again in the afternoon and swap
seats. Yeah.
And then we've always got the possibility, say flight 1, the customer gets up there and over the radio says, I'm really nervous, this is not comfortable. Shut the door, swap seats, open the door again, keep going. So you've always got, that's why I use the air van. Whereas the Cessnas, if you go up in like the 206s, you've got to remove the door. So from takeoff, you can't take your seatbelt off. You're strapped in until you get out of the plane again.
Yeah.
Whereas, the air vans, I'll always use them. They're not as fast, but they're more stable. So you'll find if you're getting any turbulence and whatnot, they're actually a lot more stable than the Cessnas.
Yeah. Doors off the whole time would be, I was nervous in the chopper, like you strapped in, but, seatbelts, they're not like harnesses. They're just little seatbelts and it rolls over and stuff like that. So it's like, once you take off, you're not doing a lot of moving until you land again.
No.
So being able to close that door would be nice.
It is. The difference too is you don't get the buffeting, you don't get the downdraft off the rotors like you do in choppers.
Yeah.
So with this, physically, I find it's a lot smoother out of the aircraft. And we only do these in winter. If you go up there, you'd be a sucker for punishment if you go up there outside of winter because the thermals, it'd be like flying over a mirror, essentially. It's just, you're going to hit pockets of turbulence. I have flown up there outside of winter, and I can honestly say I wouldn't sign anyone up to do it. So my season, I always do them between May and August. I generally find, that's when most of the time the water's going to come in anyway. But as it starts to dry is where you start getting the better color anyway. So everyone wants to see Lake Air full. But if it's just filled, it's like you may as well just take a photo at the top of your cup of coffee. It's just going to be brown and murky. Whereas as it dries up, that's where all the algal blooms will start as well. And as soon as you get stagnant water is where you get color.
Yeah, and that's when you get those beautiful colors.
Yeah, and it's just silt, sand, and salt, essentially, and then algae as well.
See if I can find... There was a couple of other photos at the start of this gallery that were just...
there's one that looks like a human torso. Yeah, that one. It looks like... I call it Fit Homer Simpson. It looks like a cross-section of Homer Simpson's anatomy.
It does. There's abs. You can see abs here.
Yeah. That's how I've always seen it. That was on my first trip up there. So, the first trip I took up there, I was up with Tourism South Australia. So there was a guy I was dealing with that put me on to the owner of William Creek Hotel and Wrights Air that owned the aircraft. And I was flown up there on behalf of Tourism SA. And we basically went into Flinders Ranges and looked around Wilpena. And for me, I wanted to create a tour that did Flinders Ranges with Lake Air.
Yep.
But with the amount of airtime just to get between Flinders Ranges and Lake Air, it was just putting the price point too high. So I just decided the hero here is Lake Air. So let's just do a Lake Air trip and stay at William Creek and just you're within a 20-minute flight every time you get out to the lake. So, I just went out there for about 3 hours, went out for lunch to meet with the owner. They took me on a flight for an hour around the southern end of Lake Air North. And still to date, this is my image to beat. And that was just, the first hour ever doing it. So that's my elephants behind me for Lake Air. That's the one to beat.
I love how you've got an image to beat for each location. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Keeps you hungry going back.
Well, you just see, the great thing with Lake Air is wind governs where the water is, not tides, because it's an inland lake. And as it fills, it's so shallow that as soon as there's wind, it blows it across to the other side within even one day. Yep. So we've flown over areas in the morning where we've gone back up in the afternoon and it's shifted. and all the silt's in a different location, and it looks completely different to 6 hours earlier.
Wow, that fast.
Yeah. So if you're going up there running, like I've had trips, each month, probably four trips in 1 year, where I've gone up in late April, mid-May, late May, early June, then late August, as an example. And every trip is entirely different.
Yeah.
And I've got customers. There's one of my regular customers down here, Heather, from Melbourne. She's been with me on this trip, I think, 5 times now.
Oh, wow. Really?
And every time gets something different. There's never a trip where it's like, it kind of wasn't as good as last year. It's never a case of if it's as good. It's just, it's different. You get different color, different patterns. Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like a abstract art, it's like, yeah. Crazy.
And you get stuff like this. It looks like some alien, but that's actually a mound spring. So it's an underground spring that pushes water up. So all of the sand and sediment underground pours up from the center of the mineral springs. And then where the water starts to leach off, you'll see it sometimes turns blood red. I mean, you've got some shots where you've got these like blue and red, and it's just algae and salt, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
That one looks like, to me, it looks like a heart. Like you've got the valves at the top, and to me, that's always reminded me of a heart.
That blue is wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, so cool. So cool.
But it is, it's the sort of thing that it came to me from, I was actually flying from Darwin back to Melbourne after doing a trip to Kakadu. And I remember flying over Lake Eyre and seeing it from, a Qantas jet and going, I wonder what that looks like closer to the ground. So as soon as I got home, I opened Google Maps. I didn't know much about Lake Eyre or anything. I just opened Google Maps, and my job at Canon with Canon Collective was to create unique experiences for our customers, which led me to speak to SA Tourism, which led me going on a recce and producing the trips that I produced. But I just remember thinking, I wonder what it's like. So up comes Google Maps. I'm scrolling around. Next minute, I see William Creek. I see it has an airstrip. I look up the website. I see they also have an aviation company who's the same guy that owns the hotel, which is the only place that you can stay at out there. And a couple of phone calls later, within 3 months of negotiations and backwards and forwards, I'm on a plane up there and I'm bolting a trip together. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's that quick. But so that just came from flying over at 30,000 feet.
Yeah. Yep. And on average, so the shots you would have seen most of the time, I'm between 500 and 1,500 feet most of the time. So you can go higher. So when you get much bigger areas, then, we get up to maybe 7,000 feet in some cases. There's a spot out there we call the brain, and it looks like a brain. It's this big green patch of, it's a big marsh, essentially, a big boggy marsh. And the earth is really hard red rock. And where the water wells up, all the grass grows and it squiggles around, and it literally looks like a brain with a spinal cord on it. So for that one, we'll go up maybe 5,000 feet, just so if you lower to the ground, perspective warps. It doesn't look circular; it looks elongated. So to keep that perspective round, you've got to get height. So we just communicate with the pilots if we want more altitude or less altitude. So I generally find, and again with gear, coming back to gear for aerial work, different locations, I'll use different lenses. If you had to guess what the best lens is for those photos, what would you say I was using?
24 to 105.
That's what everyone says.
Damn it.
100 to 400.
Really?
400. I'm 300 to 400 mil most of the time. I'd say 90% of the shots. And that's even at 500 feet. Yep. So I find if you're too wide, everything's too far away and small, and you kind of miss everything. Like you fit it all in, but you're looking at fine patterns and details rather than something big and in your face. Yeah. I do shoot a second body with a wider lens on it, but I'll look at my Lightroom catalogs, and literally 90% every trip is 100 to 400, and 300 mil onwards is part of that reason is because I'm in the forward seat shooting backwards through the door. So I'm very late on everything because the customers have got the priority seats. Yeah. Whereas the seats the customers are in, you can probably shoot a bit wider because you're on top of it, not shooting back on it. Yep. So I'm half a kilometer shooting the same thing that they were shooting 2 minutes ago because it's right out the back door from where I'm sitting. Otherwise, I've got to shoot through 2 layers of glass because I've got a window, then the door's open with another window.
Yes.
So if I was to shoot out the window, I get nothing. So it's a case, again, I'll go up without customers. Yeah.
With the plane, though, I did notice that it looked like, I think they both had 100, 400s maybe on as well. So it looked like even in those seats, they were preferring to get in tighter on things as well.
Yeah. So 100 mil is fairly wide. I mean, you fit pretty much, if you see a big, colourful patch on the ground, it'll all fit in at 100 mil. But then when you start picking off the little details that make up structure and all of the abstract colour and whatnot, it can be runoff from a dried creek bed or an inlet, and it looks like, tree roots, that type of thing.
Yep.
You might pick off that and just shoot it looking like a tree at 400 mil, whereas you pull back, you get the whole picture at 100.
Yeah.
So there's really not a great deal of use for a wider angled lens up there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But for that one, I mean, those tuned in and listening, if you're interested in those trips, it's just lakeairfromtheair.com. So Lake Air is, yeah. So Lake Air is not as in AIR, it's EYRE.
Yeah. Whereas a lot of the other tours, the Antarctica tour particularly, that can be found on the Photography Workshop Co. website. If you just Google the Photography Workshop Co.
Yeah, definitely.
And then there's a heap of other experiences on there too. I saw, were you running just a local, was it a Birds of Prey workshop?
Yep.
Yes, over the weekend?
Yeah, that was just a normal, just wild birds. And I've got one coming up in Hillsville Sanctuary, which obviously are captive birds, but it's more about training and getting in with guaranteed sightings. Whereas the wild birds, it's luck of the draw, which I just did on the weekend. And unfortunately, we had really foggy weather. So we got unusual pictures, which are hard to get, ducks on complete fogs. You got these really weird, high key, misty, haunting shots, which I actually really liked. It was pretty cool. But then the Birds of Prey workshops, again, it's partnering with the owner who has the largest private collection of Australian birds of prey in Australia on a property up near Ballarat. So that's at the end of this month, and you've got 3 hours of these birds being flown directly into your lens. So it's really the only sort of place in Australia where you can get that experience. And he does that exclusively with me. So it's a cool workshop as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. And it's those kind of things that it's like, you've just got to make time to go and do them, and a workshop. So yeah, I've done a lot of workshops over the years, whether it's for, when I was a wedding photographer, I would make sure to try and get to as many as I could. It was always hard because you'd look at the price and you'd be like, I could buy a new lens or I could go to this workshop. And then, you finally get someone who talks you into making the right decision and going to the workshop, because a new lens doesn't do, unless you're at the point where you're still trying to put together just a basic camera kit, a new lens won't do for you what a workshop will do.
Yeah.
And
the thing is, like workshops, if it's development into something that is becoming work and you get a return on it. So, I mean, being a wildlife photographer, there's a lot of outlay and not a lot of return on investment. So, working to try and make money doing it, it's not as easy. But, that image was sold to American Express Travel one year for about $7,000 for a one-off promotion they were doing for like their, I think it was a travel insurance ad in the US. So I think it was like 3 months just for a mail distribution, header on their paperwork for 3 months.
Yeah,
I've got some stuff coming up actually with a lot of Australian content, which was about a $13,000 to $15,000 sale, selling images. So look, it does come. And then, for me, obviously my business is paying clients and taking them on these experiences. But, for me, I'd rather develop workshops that is worth the money. There are a lot of people out there that will run photographic education and photographic workshops, and you jump online at any given time at Eventbrite and there's 200 different people offering a photo walk in Melbourne CBD. And I don't jump in and compete with that market because there's 200 other people that do it, and I'm not interested in doing what everyone else is doing. So I really, would rather produce something that not everybody does, not everybody can do. And again, it's forming those partnerships that ensures that it's exclusive and it's worth every dollar of admission. So, yeah.
Very cool. I'm keen as. I'll be jumping onto one. I just don't know what yet. And then, setting my sights on Antarctica. I don't know when. Sometime.
Well,
So
Africa and Antarctica, I mean, both of them, the best time to go is ASAP because they go up in price every year.
yeah, that's a
So
good
it
point.
inherently will happen. You'll find all of the lodges, basically 3 to 5% most years. Is you'll look at this season versus next season's pricing, and you're probably looking at about 125 US a night more.
Yeah.
Every night. So every year it just keeps getting more and more expensive. Yeah.
How early do your Africa tours for this year already all booked out?
Look, it's hard. This year's ones were all sold out without advertising, and that was because
Yeah.
they were last year's customers. We were all sitting around the campfire last year, just joking about, oh, where are we going next year? And all of these customers were seasoned veterans in Africa. Some were first timers, but a majority of them were repeat customers. So they've kind of done the locations that everyone wants to do, and they wanted now to get into a location that not everybody gets to do. You know, it certainly wouldn't be the first pick for some people. Either it's too exotic and far out, or it's not going to give me the postcard locations that I want to see classic Africa. So the
Yeah.
Okavango is the crown and the jewel. It's you would aspire to it, and you've got to have the means and the money to get there, unfortunately, like we discussed earlier. So
Yeah.
everyone had done the migration before in Kenya. They've done the Sabi Sands in South Africa. So I said to them, look, do you want to go to the Okavango Delta? And they've gone, yeah, I've always dreamed of it and it's time to do it. So we just sold it out straight away. So didn't have to advertise that one. But look, just with the way the economy is, things aren't filling as quickly. Antarctica certainly last year, we sort of got the numbers a bit quicker and people are probably watching the budget and, you know, those paying a mortgage that are now having to scrape up $1,500 extra a month just to pay for, you know, their mortgage and then put food on the table. So I get it. It's a tough one. But look, there's always a market in what I do for high-end experiences. And it's lucky for me in a case that usually people that have money can afford it. You know, a lot of the time you'll have, you'd love to do a trip with you, but your trips are too expensive. There's a lot of competitors in the market that do offer the lower end stuff, but the experience is very different as a result as well. So I tend to find I'm happy with filling the amount of tours I do a year without having to be away for 6 months of the year. So I'd much rather know that I'm doing something at, you know, at the top of the game with the best possible sightings, with the best possible team, than to do something half-baked in order to make money off customers and you're not providing them with the best experience. I personally wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's better, you know, knowing that you can provide a great experience than trying to compete on price and having to cut corners. You don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. I actually had a heap of other things I wanted to dig into, but it's already been 3 hours, which is crazy.
Yeah. No, it feels like 30 minutes.
Yeah, I know. I'm mindful of your time in your day because I want to talk about. Maybe we might have to do a part 2 one day because I want to talk about your concert photography. I want to talk about the series of portraits. I don't know. I think we might have to. What do you reckon? We do a part 2 one day?
Oh, it's up to you. I've got nowhere to be. I don't know if you need to be anywhere, but
I don't have nowhere to be. But let's have a quick look at some concert photography because it's been it's been catching my eye. So this was one of the first things you started doing?
Yeah, so I was actually shooting. So when I left school, I left before my final exams in year 12 because I wasn't doing the subjects I wanted to do. And music, I was, you know, a musician anyway, and I was obsessed with shooting music. So 98 was the first music festival I had a AAA pass to shoot, the Vans Warped Tour. And at that time, I think it was, trying to remember who played that year. I know it was Suicidal Tendencies, Deftones, Pennywise, a few others. So, you know, I went and shot that music festival. Before that, it was just mates' bands and smaller bands, and ended up working for a bunch of different publications over the years and shooting music. But I actually left high school to do a 2-year course in music industry and business, and ended up working with a whole bunch of different publications. But doing work directly with bands. So, I mean, this is a band from the States, the Dillinger Escape Plan, who top 3 band for me. I actually flew to New York in 2017 to see their last 3 shows ever because they called it a day. And I was literally 2 days out of hospital from having kidney stones, and I still went and pretty much pissed blood for 5 days and was in agony to go.
But
Really? And
yeah,
just to watch, or did you shoot those shows as well, or
just to watch. I mean,
just to
I'd
watch?
been in contact with Ben, this guy here, the guitarist, and I just said, look, I'm not in a good way. Is there any chance you just get me a media pass and, I'll shoot and whatnot? And he said, look, I'm turning back global media on this. It's already full. The VIP section's full. He's like, I can put you in the disabled section if you want. I'm like, nah, I'm not going to stand at the back of the crowd. I need to be amongst it. But, probably against the health advice of doctors, I went in anyway and did it. But yeah, no regrets. It was awesome.
Oh, that's
But,
unreal.
yeah, I mean, I worked with Dillinger a couple of times when they came over. A good friend of mine, Chris Marrick, was one of their PR managers in Australia for a bunch of record labels. He did all the PR for Relapse, which was their record label at the time, and that opened up a lot of doors as well. It's who you know, not what you know in the music industry, big time, because there's 100 kids behind you wanting to do what you do, and there's less and less publications now. And there's just no money in it. That's why I stopped shooting music. There's,
Well,
no money yeah.
So to get access in the first place, what did you have to do to get your foot in the door? Were you working for a publication that got you access?
No. So Vans Warped was the first one that I did that was a major thing. And out of that, I would have only been 18, 19, possibly 98.
Yeah.
I'm not great with maths, but I'm 44 this year and do the numbers. But I wrote a letter to them. This is before email was a thing. And just said, I want to do this as a career. And I was lucky enough back in the day when I was working at Nikon, I worked with a guy called Andrew King, and his dad was Bob King, who industry legend. You'd put him in, the top music photographers in the world. There was him and Tony Mott, both here in Australia, and they highly influenced me. And, I worked with his son and Nikon Professional Services. Bob would come in and I'd look after Bob with camera gear, and I was stoked. It was a bit, starstruck in a way.
Yeah.
And, Bob's been AC/DC's touring photographer. He's been Rolling Stones touring photographer. He's shot the Beatles. He's shot Elvis. He's done it all, right? So to get to that level, the industry was very different back then. And I know for me, when I started doing it, there were a ton of publications. And then that got even bigger when the internet started, because you had online and print. Then print media took a nosedive, and before you knew it, there were very little publications. So a lot of big bands like Kiss, as an example, wouldn't allow no agencies, because agencies will sell those images to whichever magazine wants to run a story.
Yeah.
And that might end up in a publication that Kiss don't want represented. Say, adult magazines, Playboy might do an article on rock music, and Gene Simmons, of all people, probably belongs in that type of magazine anyway, might be against it. Just as an example, that's where they wouldn't allow agencies. Metallica was the same thing. They wanted to control where the images would end up. So you'd have to apply through the publication for you'd need an accreditation. So the PR manager would basically open up and take in all the requests, and then they'd sit back and look at the requests and know the magazines, know the reputation of the magazines. They'd supply feedback back to management of the band, or the band would have very specific set of regulations that they don't want to appear in these magazines. So if accreditation pass request comes through, that gets declined. So bigger music festivals are hard because you've got different wishes of different bands. So I know from shooting, say, Soundwave and Big Day Out, stuff like that, you'd have some bands that wouldn't allow agencies and some that would. So they'd have to check your accreditation pass. So I know like Iron Maiden were very, very particular on what photographers could shoot. There's Ozzy Osbourne, Black Sabbath. He didn't care less. You do what you want.
Didn't give a shit.
He probably had no idea you were there anyway. But in a way, I mean, I remember going into this show thinking, oh, God, this is going to be like watching a road crash. I'm a metal fan, and, Black Sabbath started metal, right? So I just thought, oh, God, this is going to be like watching a road crash. And he's a different person on stage. He just gives it on. You just know he walks off stage and goes straight to bed because he's absolutely knackered. But, it was surprisingly better. And then like Kiss too, I can't stand their music, but live, one of the most amazing bands to shoot, because as soon as they saw you move into a position and hold a camera up,
they play to you for a second before they give it back to the crowd. Whereas
Yeah.
every other band couldn't care less. They don't give you a thing. Whereas these guys are a marketing machine. They want every photo that's hitting the media to look like that.
Yeah, well, that photo looks like a if you were like, all right, we need to design a poster for an upcoming tour, so let's get lighting in and let's get everything designed and set up for the photographer so that we can just do this stylized shot. That's what this looks like. It looks like it was set up, you know.
That's the thing, but the only guys selling those posters are Kiss, and that's where they're making their money. You should see the clause, the contract you have to sign before you get your accreditation for these guys.
Oh, I bet. Did you have to just hand your camera over at the end of the shoot and they strip you down naked or something?
Not far off, but it was definitely. I mean, they didn't go as far as what you. The rule was the publication is the only place that can use the images you take for the agreed edition, so you can't resell it into a different edition. So you're applying for this issue that's coming out this month.
Yep.
So then you can't go on and sell it.
And you can use it for your own portfolio to display. So say you could, these days, could you post this on social media now and say, I shot this image? Could you put it on your profile?
Depends if it was deemed as commercial use. So if you were using it to promote your services as a business, then they'd probably wind up in court saying that you were using it commercially to attract business. So, in roundabouts, it's commercial usage. So technically that would be against the contract that you agree to. Whereas, Taylor Swift and people like that, and Iron Maiden as well, you had to send the images to their management for approval before you could even use them. So they'll go back and say, of the 15 that you are hoping to run, you can only use image 1 and image 3. You can't use the others. And that might just be because, the funny look on the face or something that the artist didn't like about it. But some of them, and, this hardcore band from Scandinavia refused. Backlit. Was all backlit. There was literally not a lighting can at the front. So that was the Enmore Theatre in Sydney. And, you can't, I liken it to wildlife. You can't control what's going on. You can't control the light. You've just got to adapt. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the coolest part.
Yeah. And that's what I loved about it. I mean, you've got the best seat in the house for 3 songs. And then, so that was with, I think it was either Terrorizer or Kerrang, one or the other in UK that one ran, was a 6-page on the Australian tour. So that was not the last one they did, the one before that. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. What, Metallica. Man. Yeah. What a dream.
That's probably one of the most memorable. I mean, I grew up obsessed with Metallica, not so much these days, but, to shoot this was on their Death Magnetic tour, which had in the round. So normally from a media pit, you're in between the stage and the crowd, right? You get first 3 songs, no flash, and then you get out. So with this particular tour, the stage was low. So even when you were standing next to the stage, it came just above your hips. So they were really, really close to you, and you could walk all the way around the stage. So normally you'd only get lines based at the front of the stage to choose from. So you're either standing in front of them or shooting across stage. With this, you could walk all the way around the stage. So you could pick angles. So I was particularly for this shot, when he came to that mic, I was lining the light up behind him, knowing that I'd get lens flare shooting straight into it. So it's the only concert I've had where you could create the shots because you had unrestricted access as to where you could go.
Yeah, freedom of movement around. Yeah, that's so cool. But so did you have to stay crouched the whole time? Did you say if you stood up, you would be sort of at the stage would be at waist height?
Yeah, probably just above hip height. So we had first 3. I mean, they opened on this one, I think, with For Whom the Bell Tolls. So it was probably like 8.5-minute song.
Yep.
Then I can't remember. Essentially, the first 3 songs equated to nearly half an hour. So I had a ton of time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. Do you miss shooting music?
I do. It's something I love to do. I mean, that last shot with Amyl and the Sniffers, they opened for Smashing Pumpkins on their recent tour, which I shot it was probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. And that's the first live show that I've done in years because I just haven't been chasing the work. I mean, there hasn't been the work anyway because of COVID, but it's the first big production show that I'd shot in a few years for the simple fact that I just gave up shooting it because, there was a lot of kids competing for the access and no one paying. So commercially it just made no sense to add to the problem. So I just bowed out. Yeah.
Do you think actually there's another a podcast called Behind the Shot that I was listening to, and there was a guy on there who's the photographer for, this is going to sound bad, but I'm not really a country fan. What's that super famous country singer at the moment?
Neither am I. I know who you're talking about, but yeah.
He's megastar. He'll come to me. Anyway, he's his photographer, and he actually was able to organize with him to run workshops at his shows. Yeah. So the artist allowed his photographer to bring, I think, a group of 4 or 5 people to a show. They scope the stage out, check out sound check and stuff like that, and then they get to shoot a couple of songs. Yeah. Which is, to me, sounds like what an experience to be able to offer people, like with access to a real band.
We actually did that a few years ago with Canon Collective. We did that because Guy Sebastian was one of the ambassadors. So it was one of his shows. It was Guy Sebastian, I think Shannon Knoll, and then we did another thing with Tina Arena, and I'm trying to remember who the other one was, but it was the same deal. It was each show in each major city. We had 10 access passes to shoot the first 3 with all the other media in the pit. And then when all the media kicked out, then they got an extra 2 songs. So they got more than what the media got. And that was, again, another initiative with Canon Collective, which, doesn't exist anymore for the fact that they closed it down. So it's a sad thing, but yeah.
Is it something you'd ever consider trying to do, like a workshop experience in the music?
Impossible.
Sort of things? Too hard.
Yeah. Well, it's just there's too many. I mean, unless the band was making money off it, why are they going to want to do it?
Yeah.
They might do it. I think Parkway Drive or one of the others possibly at some stage, I think might have done something for their fans. That. But, for someone that's going to commercialize out of it, like, for me to contact any band, they're just going to go, no.
I think the only way this guy was able to do it was he had a really good relationship with the artist and said, here's what I want to do. And they were just like, yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I don't care. Like, it, sounds good as long as I think they sort of have some control over what can be done with the images. And I think they get to use the images if they want to, that kind of thing. But I'm trying to remember who it is. It's not Urban. Are you saying Keith Urban? It's not Keith Urban. No.
Nah.
It's, it's on the tip of my tongue. Someone in the chat, throw it in there. Super famous. He's like a megastar at the moment. But anyway, I couldn't believe that he would even, you'd think when people get that big, they would just say, nah, I don't want any of that at my show. Like, got to focus on my show.
Yeah. You look at some of the hardest contracts. I mean, literally Google Taylor Swift media contract or photography contract, and someone's taken a picture of it and posted it online. It's brutal. She pretty much says, you don't come in unless if I see a photo that I want, I get.
Yeah.
So you're signing away your copyright. Yeah. It's like, if I come for it and you say no, I'll see you in court.
Yeah.
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 And I actually photographed Taylor Swift before she was famous. So I've actually got pictures when most of the media didn't even pick up their lens. They couldn't care less. She was nobody at that time.
Really?
That was it was a festival called Sound Relief that was done it was either the bushfires or floods years ago. One or the other. And it's at the time when I think she was dating Zac Efron. And this is when Twilight was really big. So this is more than 15 years ago. And Coldplay played at it, Icehouse, Barry Gibb, UMI, a bunch of other Australian stuff. It was at Sydney Football Stadium. And I was there with another photographer that was really well known in the music industry, which was David Anderson. And David, him and his team used to have the contract for the arias and anything that happened in Australian music. It was David Anderson, Bob King, and Tony Mott. They were the top 3. So on the day, covering this whole festival officially for the organisers was myself, David Anderson, Tony Mott was the head, and then Bob King was in there shooting for a bunch of different magazines. And that ended up on the DVD sleeves, covers, all the PR, all of it. And Taylor Swift was one of the first. I think Coldplay actually opened because they had a show that night that they had to go to. So they opened, and that ensured that there was a full capacity crowd at the start. And then I think Taylor Swift was on second, and no one had heard of her. Like, there were some kids screaming because she was Zac Efron's girlfriend, and that was it. So, and do you
Yeah,
think I
right.
can find the photos now? I couldn't tell you. Luke Coombs, that's the one.
Luke Coombs, yeah. Thank you, Jay Shammy.
Uh,
Thank you, Luke Coombs. That is him.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Not to
right.
be
So you've got
mixed up with Peter Coombs. You're about my pedigree when it comes to age, the old Peter Coombs.
Yep.
The funniest thing
Yeah,
is,
we're
I
old.
reckon it was probably 10 years ago. I went and saw Peter Coombs at the Enmore, and it was this tour he did, literally, to get the Enmore full of people swilling beers, singing along to songs that I used to sing in kindergarten. So the whole room was full of like 35 to 50-year-olds,
Really?
literally getting on the piss watching Peter Coombs live at the Enmore. It was hilarious.
That's great. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
It's weird when you get older and all that stuff sort of, and then similar kind of weird thing happened when the Wiggles cover won Triple J Hottest 100, mainly because, it's, I don't know, it's strange when you get old and your stuff circles around again.
It's the nostalgia, and that's where so many bands are doing these comebacks and, cashing in because you can make money. It used to charge, $60 to see a band 10 years ago that now is going to be a $300 ticket.
Yeah.
And it's just, production costs. And I did have a lot to do with that side of the music industry, and it's just changed. And, bands used to make all their money off record sales, and now it's touring. If you don't tour and you don't sell merch, you don't survive in the industry.
Did you ever shoot Parkway Drive?
Yeah. Yep. Shot them. My old band toured with them in the earlier years before they were really known.
We opened for them in Bendigo when they when they came here. Yeah, before they were known. We actually brought them here. We used to run gigs when I was in a band, like early 20s. We would run sort of gigs in Bendigo because otherwise we had nowhere to play.
Yeah. What band?
I don't want to say. We were called Blank Expression. We were not good, but we were not good. We had great fun. And yeah, we opened for them when we brought them to Bendigo, which was that's my claim to fame.
Yes,
they were sort of starting to get popular in the, in the hardcore scene, but they were nowhere near where they are now. Like
that's the thing. We were, technical death metal in a way, so we didn't belong in a bill with a hardcore band, and we'd never played on lineups with a hardcore band. So I'd not experienced hardcore dancing. So I remember these guys came on. I'm like, who's this Parkway Drive band? And there's these kids doing like spin kicks in the pit. And I'm like, what the hell is this? That was my first experience to it. And little did we know, they're now one of the biggest headlining bands in the world. So
I love seeing where they've been able to come from. And I assume you've watched their documentary.
Yeah, Viva the Underdog. Yeah.
And the guy that's like essentially running their stage show was like an electrical apprentice that used to just follow them around a show. I love that. That's so good. Such a good
That's
story.
the thing. They just haven't changed. They've always just been the surfers from Byron that just lucked out. They've worked their ass off for it. So I wouldn't say lucked out was the right words to choose, but lucked out in the case that, that's a 1 in a million. There's a million other bands that play a similar style of music that didn't make it. And that's through business decisions that these guys made.
Hard work. But also even then to get as big as they have, like they could do everything right and still have a dream run and get huge and not be anywhere near as big as they are, because they got mainstream big, but they're extremely heavy.
Yep,
it's crazy.
But that's the thing, and as much as those budgets are in there, and this sort of circles back to bring it back to photography, there's no budget left for a photographer.
Yes,
bands once they get to that stage will generally have their own photographer to cover that type of stuff. So a band blows in, you don't pick up the job; they're touring with somebody. So it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, and that because they want someone that that understands them, that gets the lifestyle stuff as well, gets different perspectives from each show, because they're kind of putting together an entire story as opposed to just, I've got one night to shoot Parkway Drive, so I'll do all this stuff. So they'll be the ones that are sort of in the back of the venue or up in the or up behind a speaker stack or something, getting weird angles and things, because they've got an entire tour to play with.
Or they know what's happening, so like, stuff's choreographed and they know what's coming. Whereas, I'd say 99% of the shows that I've ever photographed, you've got no idea. You just go in for 3 songs and you shoot what happens, and you work with light. And for me, I pay attention to the sequence of the light.
Exactly.
There's no point chasing a correct exposure when the light sucks and the light's good. You sit and watch the sequence in the light, find out where the good light is, expose for that, and shoot. But I found there's only 2 shows that I ever shot where it was a little bit more controlled, and one of them was Slipknot because of pyro, and being told for this song you have to shoot from here, and it's because you're not going to get your face blown off by pyro. And the other one was U2 because the PR agent would come out. We were all in the conference room before the show, and that was on that 360 tour they did with the round stage, where they walked around through the crowd. So we were on a little platform at the side of the outer circle. So we're told, Bono will come out this way, the Edge will come out this way. They're going to stop and they're going to rock out in front of each other, and then they're both going to turn and look at you. Then they're going to cross paths. When that happens, stay on Bono because he's going to turn around and go like this into your lens. And we knew what was going to happen. So, I mean, you can just imagine those are the shots that they want to see in press. Yeah.
I was going to say, it's interesting. It's like, it's a little bit manufactured, but they're going to get the image that they're looking to get across most publications by wording you up about what's going to happen. It's smart. It's smart.
Definitely.
Amazing.
So look, it's, the unpredictable nature, the action of it, the volume, the music. I mean, that's what I was hooked on. I was just addicted to doing it. And then, wildlife was always the thing for me growing up that I was passionate about. But, that's overtaken. The amount of work as a career now is overtaken for travel and wildlife from music. But there was a long time where, music was what was bringing money into the bank outside of obviously working with Nikon and Kodak and Canon and all the other brands. But yeah.
So I guess also, you've done some pretty amazing things when it comes to music photography. So it's like you can kind of sit back and be like, well, I've shot Metallica and stuff. So maybe you've
I've probably got
a good bow on it.
That's the thing. I can kind of go tick, done it. Like, if I'm honest, there's not a whole lot of music coming out that's exciting me anymore. So it kind of just become work. You'd still enjoy it, but it's far more enjoyable when they're bands you enjoy. But would I jump in and do it again? Still, if there was a commercial reason to do it, I would. I just don't want to be that person that's taking the pass and doing it and fueling the fact that nobody else is getting paid to do it either. So I'll just sign out. I did the glory days, and I'll sit and hang my hat up and say that I loved it. Yeah.
Stick to wildlife.
Yeah, definitely.
Sounds good. Well, maybe we should leave it there.
Sure thing.
Wonderful. I'll close this one off. Thanks everyone that's still watching.
Thanks everyone.
Later on, leave us a comment down below. There'll be links in the description for all of Jay's stuff, his social profiles, the Photography Workshop Co website, all that kind of stuff. And otherwise, Jay, stay on the line for a second after I end this, and we'll see you on the next one.
Will do. Cheers, guys.